I was just waking up in recovery when one of the nurses came in to check on my vitals. She was taking my pulse when I looked up and noticed her face clearly. She was possibly the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, with blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a figure that even the shapeless hospital scrubs couldn't conceal. Sabrina had been the light of my life, and she paled next to this girl. She wasn't looking at my face, and she quirked a smile. "Like what you see, soldier?" she asked knowingly. "Sorry," I said breathlessly. "You must get guys staring at you all the time," I observed sympathetically. "I do, but how about you close your eyes for a minute and let me get a clear reading on your pulse without your eyes making your heart pound?" she asked with some amusement. I closed my eyes obediently, and she took my pulse. "I really didn't mean to stare," I told her, trying to apologize again. "It just took me by surprise, is all. I've spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I've never seen anyone as beautiful as you working in any of them. I'll try not to stare from now on." "You do look a little beat up," she commented. "Where'd you get injured? Iraq or Afghanistan?" "Lakewood Boulevard," I told her dryly. "What?" she blurted. "I thought you're not a soldier?" I opened my eyes and looked into her beautiful blue eyes. "No, ma'am," I told her. "I was a designated driver on New Year's and got in an accident. I just dropped off my last passenger, so the only person I failed to get home safe and sound was me. I was run over by irony." She smiled at that. "That's a good attitude, soldier," she said, winking at me. "Learn to laugh about it, and you don't end up crying about it." She chatted with me a little more as she was checking my for and making sure my dressings didn't need changing. I learned her name was Lorraine, or Lori for short, and she was used to the surge of male attention. She told me that I'd be in for a couple of days, due to the extensive nature of the scarring they'd worked on. It turned out that I ended up in a good news, bad news situation. The bad news was that I was the proud new owner of a brand new post-op infection. The good news was that I'd get to spend a little more time basking in the light of my new favorite nurse as they kept me in to treat the infection. We talked a little during the times that she was in with me, and I took to closing my eyes when she was with me. "What's up?" she asked me a few days later, tapping me on the forehead. "You've been closing your eyes whenever I come in. You decide that you don't like how I look after all?" I laughed at that and opened my eyes to look at her. "I've been doing an experiment," I admitted, gauging her reaction. "I wanted to see if I liked you for your personality or if I was won over by your stunning good looks." She smiled brightly at that. "And how's your experiment going so far?" she asked. "Not so good," I admitted. "I still find myself looking forward to every minute I get to spend talking to you. But now I'm not sure if I like you for your personality or if I'm just falling in love with the sound of your voice." That made her laugh. "Nicely done," she complimented me. "So how do you make sure?" I thought about that. "Well, there's two ways that I can think of," I admitted. "I could ask for your number and we could get into text conversations, friend each other online, and use messengers and emails to stay in touch after I'm released back into the wild." "And what's the other way?" she asked, amused. "I could ask you out to dinner, and we can see how long before I stop thinking you're stunning." She snickered at that. "I think there's an ethical problem with dating a patient," she told me dismissively. "Well, obviously I'd wait until I was out of here for our first date," I said, exasperated. "Have you had the food here?" Feeding this to a girl on a first date is a great way to never get past the first date. "That's true," she laughed and then shrugged. "Sure," she said finally. "Not gonna lie, that is the best news I've had in 3 years," I told her ardently. She smiled at me. "Just get better and we'll talk about where you can take me," she said lightly, then glanced at the door. "Not that I'm ashamed about it, but I'm gonna try not to mention it to the rest of the nursing staff on the floor," she told me. "I don't date and the girls think I'm gay because of it. The gossip flows freely around here." I nodded. "I'll try not to look like I've been put on the good painkillers," I promised. "I'll have some trouble keeping the grin off my face though." "Slap yourself on the hip if you start getting too happy," she said dryly and patted my surgery scar to demonstrate. She winked at me, and then she was gone to check on some of the other patients. I was on cloud 9. When Eve came to visit me later in the day, she looked at me oddly. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I told her. "I'm feeling pretty damn good actually." "Why? Don't I look it?" "You look high," she said. "I figured they must have put you on some kind of new medication." I shook my head. "No, nothing like that," I assured her. "I've just been in a good mood all day." She nodded. "Well, it's weird. Cut it out. Moan about the pain, or whine about being stuck in here, or whimper about the hospital food, or bitch about getting an infection in the first place. You could at least complain that the hospital Wi-Fi sucks." "Okay," I said with a smile. "The hospital Wi-Fi is the worst. Can you believe how bad it is? Like, is this a hospital in Russia or something?" She sat down and dramatically swiped an arm across her brow. Phew. Now I feel better. So you want to tell me why you're really on top of the world? I think I need that to be a surprise for a little while longer, but I promise, I'll tell you sooner or later, I said with a smirk and promptly slapped myself on the hip like I'd been told to do, making myself wince. What did you do that for? Eve wanted to know, looking at my hip where I'd slapped the incision. It helps when the incision itches, I told her. It actually did help some, but it was an old remedy for the itch and a healing tattoo. One of the guys in Austin had been an ink addict and had explained why he was tapping his fresh ink one day at lunch. She nodded and accepted the explanation. We settled down into more comfortable topics after that. She'd sent the Chloe Sinclair footage to the district attorney and to LAPD Internal Affairs. She'd included the login of the person that had deleted the footage originally. I was glad she'd given me the heads up when I got a call from a police detective the next day to ask about it. I work in online security, I explained to him. I have a lot of friends that work in cyber warfare, either with law enforcement, government, or freelance. So which of your friends works with LAPD? He asked. Honestly, I don't know if any of them do, I admitted. About half the people I know are vague about what they do for a living. I'm sure at least one of them works to protect vital computer infrastructure for DHS, NSA, or another of the alphabet soup agencies. When news about my accident got out, people that work in other parts of the country probably hacked in to get an idea what had happened to me. Your friends are aware that obstruction of justice is a serious charge and hacking into police servers is a perfect example of obstruction, he pointed out, leaving just a hint of a question. But they didn't obstruct justice, I told him. They preserved the data in those servers and left behind a watchdog program to tell them who accessed the data so they could continue to follow the investigation. I hadn't told you that, he pointed out to me. So you know who the hacker is. I didn't say that, I argued. I was sent a copy of the footage and the login of the person that deliberately erased your copy. So in effect, the hacker has handed you a criminal case on a silver platter, uncovered a dirty cop and done the heavy lifting for you. Threatening to charge them with a crime seems like a pretty poor way to repay their help. Don't cops ask the public to help them track down the guilty? They do, but not at the cost of what's right, he said reasonably. Maybe accessing that data wasn't technically right, but deliberately deleting the data and then lying to me about how it was lost isn't exactly the portrait of virtue. Fair enough, but that's why Internal Affairs is on the case, he said. In this case, think of the hacker as an ombudsman. They oversaw the investigation from a vantage point free from bias and prejudice and bribery. The hackers I know are categorized as white hats. They use the same techniques, but they penetrate systems for damn good reasons, not for personal gains. All I know is that they boosted the footage originally because details of the accident were hard to come by through official channels. They left the watchdog program so they'd know who was handling it for the same reason. It's hard to even get transferred to the right officer's phone if you don't know who you're looking for. It turns out that they were lucky they did that. It ended up showing that the records were erased by someone. He grunted sourly, but the LAPD was extensive, and getting in contact with an officer handling a specific case was sometimes a nightmare. He asked me a lot of questions about the accident and my recollections. I told him that I'd seen the SUV coming toward me, but that once I'd been hit, I lost the thread of what else happened. We talked for about 20 minutes, and then he let me go, promising to keep me informed as the case developed. I finally got my release orders 2 days later. Lori had told me that she'd meet me in the hospital lobby to drive me home. I'd purposely left my truck at home, so I wouldn't be leaving it in the hospital parking lot. I rode out of the hospital in a wheelchair, and she led me to her very small and sporty Kia Forte. It was bright red, 2-door, low to the ground and terrifyingly fragile looking. I was thrilled to see her and told her so. If she looked stunning at work, she was a work of art in her off time. Her hair was usually worn up, and she wore some minimal makeup. Today, she looked like she'd had a team of beauticians working all day to craft perfection, and they'd succeeded. She was dressed in form-hugging jeans and a tight top that made me glad to have eyes. Thank God you're driving, I told her faintly. I don't think I could keep my eyes on the road right now. She grinned, and as soon as I got out of the chair, she gave me a hug. I was caught off guard by how comfortable it felt, and I realized I hadn't felt this strongly about anyone in a while. I hugged her back briefly, then awkwardly made my way to the car. I felt a little nervous about the size of her car, but she was taking her day off to help me out, and I was grateful. We drove in silence for a few moments, and I couldn't help but notice how kind and thoughtful she was. Eventually, I found my voice. Sorry, I said. I promised not to stare when we first met, didn't I? Yeah, I remember you making a ridiculous promise like that. She teased me. I don't get what the fuss is about. I'm a girl. Didn't they have girls where you grew up? I chuckled. I think they had one or two, but you're sinfully beautiful, I told her. Sinfully? She asked with an arched eyebrow. A guy can hope, I shrugged. I'm just thrilled that you agreed to go out with me. I was almost as stunned by that as I was by your eyes. The laugh she treated me to was musical. I'd fallen in love with Linda over the course of high school. Sabrina had stolen my heart over the course of that summer we'd reconnected. Everything about Lori surged through my soul already. Her laugh made my breath catch. Her voice made my spine tingle. Her smile reduced me to a stuttering mess. I blinked and realized that she was the one. I got quiet and she noticed. What's wrong, Peter? She asked. I hadn't told her to call me Ham, like most everyone else did. She glanced over at me and pulled the car over to get out of traffic. Are you okay? She demanded to know. She reached over and thumbed back my eyelids to look at my eyes closely. She was worried I was in medical distress. I reached up and took her hands in mine, reeling from the lovesick way I felt, just from holding her hands. I looked in her eyes and smiled a little. I'm okay, I said softly. You've gotten close to me in a short space of time, and I didn't think that was possible. I just had an epiphany about it. She squeezed my hands in return, still looking concerned. I'm all ears, she told me, interested. I started and wondered how to tell this woman that gets hit on 50 times a day that I was head over heels in love with her after only a bare week of her company. I licked my lips, which were suddenly dry, and gazed at her. I never believed in love at first sight before, I said, nervous as a man with a lit match in a room full of dynamite. I know it's ridiculous to say that before we've even gone out on a date and the rational part of my mind is screaming at me to shut up, but I've never been blindsided like this. It's completely out of the blue. I finally managed to clamp my jaws shut and stared at her with love and terror mixing in my expression. I could feel myself blushing as my cheeks heated. She stared at me in surprise for a moment, and then she started to look more contemplative. So you're saying that you're in love with me? She asked carefully. Yeah, I definitely screwed it up. I looked down, but nodded. Yeah, I said softly, my voice still filled with wonder. I feel like everything that's happened in my life has been pushing me toward you. She thought about that and laughed a little. Like I was your destiny? She asked, amused. That tone gave me some small hope that she wasn't running for the hills. I nodded again and dared to look up at her face again. She smiled and took my hand. Tell me about your destiny, she said, and turned in her seat to face me. She has the most amazing blue eyes, like the ocean on a bright, sunny day. I started and she shook her head. Not what I meant, soldier, although you can tell me more about my eyes later, she said. Tell me about what pushed you to me. I nodded in understanding. I started with my story. I didn't scrimp on details or gloss over things. She listened, and we drove to a Starbucks to get something to drink while I shared with her. She heard about Bill and Linda, my bad reaction to it, staying with Mike, going to college here, meeting Sabrina, how much we'd made each other happy, the night that her life had ended, my desperate wish to be with her, moving to Birmingham, Mike's kids, working in Austin, Rosa, Linda's visit to try to patch things up, Mike and Mary's problems with the house, moving back here for work, my laughably bad dates, Eve, and finally, the accident, the fight to settle the suit, the depression, the worry. About addiction and the pain I'd put up with instead, the reconstruction, therapy, and the question of what to do now that I was unemployable in the short term and possibly the long term as well. After Starbucks had gotten stale, we'd gone for lunch at a restaurant I'd known from my college days while she let me pour out my story. I told her all of it, including Sabrina's occasional visits to try to straighten me out. She sounded interested in all of that. I finally wound down, realizing that I just poured out my life story to her. I'm gonna shut up now, I said apologetically. I've been talking nonstop for 2 hours. You had a lot to say, she told me generously, and you did say a lot. I can't imagine holding someone I loved while they died, she told me sympathetically. Okay, I think you deserve to hear a little about me. It's not nearly as long a story, she said. It'll explain a few things to you too. She stirred her coffee to give herself a moment to think of how to start. I was 13 when I first had sex with my brother, she started off. I was floored and it showed. She smiled and shrugged. He was 16 and I'd loved him all my life. I won't tell you the details, but I pursued him and he finally caved to my demands that he teach me. We kept that up for over 2 years. I loved him more than life, but we knew we were sunk if anyone found out. Fortunately, there's one thing that Minnesota has plenty of, and that's places to make out. We'd go camping and hiking and fishing, but really we were screwing like goats. I thought the term was screwing like bunnies, I pointed out. I tell you that I had a love affair with my own brother, and that's the part you need me to be clear about? She laughed and I realized that she was as nervous as I was. Minnesota has a lot of farms too. Goats put rabbits to shame, she told me. Rabbits generally stick to rabbits. Goats don't care. They'll mount anything that stands still long enough. That's not the point though. She took a deep breath and continued. I was 15 when he went away. He enlisted after high school. He joined the army and after training, they sent him to Iraq. I was frantic every day. He was the love of my life, and he was in danger every single day. I hated the worry and I counted the days until he was shipped home. He was gone for most of my last 2 years of high school. The first time, he was gone 14 months and came home just before Christmas of my senior year. We never got together that Christmas. He was there, but there was so much attention that we couldn't find a time or place to sneak off. We both wanted it, but there was no way. She paused and sipped her coffee to wet her throat and give herself a moment. I took her free hand in mine and just held it, letting her know that I was there to support her. She smiled at me gratefully and continued. Jeff had been injured a few times, and he had a collection of medals and decorations to his credit when he'd come home. I was proud, but also scared. He'd been in combat and gotten hurt. I decided to go into medicine at that point and threw myself into the books. I'd never been a bad student, but now I wanted to get into medical school and be a doctor so I could be there for him the next time he was hurt. It was a silly expectation, but I was motivated. He shipped back to Iraq in May. He talked a lot about using his veterans benefits to go to school. He wanted to teach. I just started studying to be a nurse when we got word that he'd been hurt by a roadside bomb. He lost both his legs, and his self-respect went with him. He got depressed and wouldn't let any of us in. By the time he was home for a year, he was drunk all the time, and one night, he killed himself. He left a note telling us that he was sorry, but he'd lost his life on that road in the sandbox. I could tell that she'd put it to rest as much as I'd put Sabrina to rest. There was sadness in her voice and her eyes, but the pain had run its course. You look a lot like him, she told me with a smile, gazing at me longingly. That's probably what got my attention. When I saw you in the hospital for the first time, you were still out. I thought I was looking at a ghost. If I look like him, then I can understand that, I told her. If I came face to face with Sabrina's double, I'd be take another look too. It wasn't just that though, she said. That wouldn't have gotten you on a date with me. You have a few of the same quirks. That whole closing your eyes thing. That's the kind of thing Jeff would have done to tease me. You're different too though. Jeff hated computers. He could never figure out how to get them to do what he wanted. He never had the ability to laugh at himself like you did when you talked about getting run over by irony. I nodded. Well, someone very smart told me that if I laugh about it, I won't have time to cry about it, I reminded her. She smiled, remembering that she told me that. So where do we go from here? She asked sheepishly. I looked at my watch and smiled. We're almost ready to go to dinner, I told her, and she gaped at the time. We've been here all afternoon? She gasped. I nodded and left a very generous tip in thanks for them letting us lounge around, even though it wasn't a busy day. Let's go back to my place and see what I need to replace in the fridge. I don't think I'll be able to trust my milk, so I'll need to get some before I can offer a lady a cup of coffee. She nodded, and we got back in her car before I answered her question. So you wanted to know where we go from here, I started as she drove. You heard my story, ghosts, my relationship with my brother and all. You're not having thoughts about running for the hills, knowing all that and hearing that I'm in love with you? She shook her head. You haven't told me anything that makes me nervous. What about you? You know I'm guilty of some pretty filthy incest, and that my brother looked like you. Does that make you hate me? Are you worried that I'll look at you and see him? She looked like she was on the edge of panic. Pull over here for a second, I told her, and her face fell. She probably thought I was going to get out and leave her here. She had another thing coming. She parked the car and looked at me hopelessly. I leaned over awkwardly because of the pressure it put on my bad hip. I reached up to cup her cheek gently in one hand and kissed her lips for the first time, tasting life in that contact for the first time in years. It was like feeling the dawn on my face after a long, dark storm. It was relief from so many pains and sorrows and anxieties that it took me by surprise. I opened my eyes and looked at her as I pulled back an inch. Did that feel like hate? I asked, gazing into her eyes, my breath tickling her lips when I spoke. She sobbed and threw her arms around my neck. I held her as well as I could in the tiny car, with the center console between us. It struck me how much courage it took for her to tell me her story. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was her confessing to a crime. The social stigma of incest, the legal consequences, and the damage to her relationship with her family. I stroked her back and told her that it was okay and that she was safe and that I loved her. I knew that she'd never told this story to anyone before. Who could she have trusted with it? I held her tighter. Face it, pretty lady, I whispered to her. You're stuck with me. Maybe we were pushed into finding each other. Her arms tightened around my neck, and we stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, she let me go and fanned her face with both hands while I settled back in the seat with a groan for my stiff hip. I must look terrible, she commented, and then saw me wincing and flexing my leg as much as I could. Your leg, she said. Why didn't you tell me you were in pain? Because you were in pain too, I told her. I chose between soothing yours and soothing mine. I made the right choice. And you look radiant. The hell you did. She complained and started the car. We have to get you home so you can stretch out. She drove directly to my place with directions and had to help me out of the car. Don't ever get in a car accident, kids. The brochures lie. It's not any fun at all. I was limping pretty badly when we finally got to the apartment and I opened the door. She guided me to the sofa and asked if I had any painkillers. I nodded and told her that they were in the medicine cabinet. She went into the bathroom and came back with the bottle, frowning at the label. These don't seem very strong, she complained, but got me a glass of water to take them with. I nodded. I started looking forward to the painkillers a little too much after the accident, so I asked the doctor to cut me back. She looked at me and shook her head. Another way you're different from Jeff, she said dryly. You need to have better medication than this, she told me firmly. Your body is still healing. You need some help right now. I nodded in agreement. Today, I could have used them, but that's okay. I had a good reason to want to be alert. She gave me a dirty look and then picked up my left leg and slowly started helping me flex it to limber me up. It was like being back in therapy, and it hurt a lot by the time she was done, but it was less stiff. Thanks, I said when she was done and tried to sit up so she could sit. She smiled and gently stopped me from moving, guiding me to sit up sideways before helping me settle back down, resting my head on her lap. She gazed down at me, gently smoothing my hair. We were completely absorbed in each other's presence. I saw my feelings reflected in her eyes, and without needing words, we communicated through soft touches. She traced her fingers over my face and shoulders, leaning over to kiss me lightly. We spent time talking, touching, and simply looking at each other. That was the beginning of something special. I had found the woman of my dreams, and she had found the man she had always hoped for. Later that evening, we ordered dinner in, and although she left reluctantly, we shared one last tender kiss at the door, not wanting to say goodnight. I have to go, she said, agonized. I have an early day tomorrow. I'll be back though, she promised. As often as you'll let me. I didn't hesitate. I gave her a key. After the accident, there were a lot of them made for all the people that had been here visiting. Rosa, Mike and Mary still had theirs. The others had admitted that they weren't sure how often they'd be back. I thought Mom still had hers though. You don't have to call, I told her. We don't have to have plans, just come over, whether you want breakfast before work or a hug on the way home or anything. She smiled and kissed me again, more deeply this time, her lips parting, and for the first time, my tongue greeted hers. She finally broke the kiss and really did have to go. When she was gone, I took stock of my kitchen, for no better reason than to keep my mind occupied. I was dismayed. My milk needed to be poured out, my eggs were bad. My lettuce looked at me like the grumpy retiree that it was about to become. My tomatoes were now well on their way to being raisins, and the list went on. I'd only planned on being in the hospital a couple of days, so I'd had food on hand that I could make with some ease. I checked it all out and decided to go shopping before it got too late. I was exhausted by the time I got back to the apartment and put everything away, but I went to bed that night, hopeful that I was right where I was supposed to be for the first time since Sabrina and I had gone to dinner that last time. The next day, I got up and was showered and wandering around the kitchen in shorts and a t-shirt when the door opened. I came to the kitchen door and beamed as Lori came to kiss me. You mentioned something about breakfast, she said hopefully. Where do you want to go? Sit down. I gestured to the kitchen table. I was just getting things started. Are you sure about the milk? She asked. We didn't get around to checking it last night. I went shopping after you went home, I told her. Everything's fine. I poured some batter into my favorite kitchen appliance, my waffle maker, and started on coffee, pausing to kiss her cheek every time I happened to be passing the table. We talked while I made her breakfast. I dreamed about Jeff last night, she told me. I haven't done that in a long time. Was it a good dream? I asked, watching her face. Yeah, she smiled. We were just talking. I was standing and he was in his wheelchair. I don't remember what we talked about, but then he smiled at me and said, he's waiting, and then told me that I looked beautiful in my dress. I looked down at myself, and I was wearing a wedding dress. When I looked up, Jeff was gone, but I was about to walk down the aisle. I arched an eyebrow. Interesting, I said and put a waffle in front of her, bringing her butter and syrup to go with it. Should I ask who was waiting nervously for you? You're going to look good in a tux, she answered me and smirked as she drowned her waffle in syrup. That was what I'd hoped for. That's good to know, I said with a smile. I don't remember my dreams from last night, but the pills normally leave me like that. When I have my discussion with Sabrina, I'm sure it'll be just as vivid as that, though. I want to see her, she said. I mean her picture. She was important to you. I want to be able to put a face to her name. I nodded and promised to dig up her picture after breakfast. I sat down a few moments later when she told me that she didn't need another one. We ate together in what became our habitual way to start the day. She laughed the first time I had a lunch ready for her when she got to the breakfast table. I learned the food she loved, and I took a little time to make sure she ate with a little variety. So, after a couple of weeks, she showed up at the apartment with several bags of groceries. What's all this? I asked, as she started putting things away. Food, she said with a smile. I don't eat at home. We have breakfast here, you make me lunch, and then I'm back here for dinner. Some of this came from my kitchen, but I went shopping for food too. That night we were planning on going out for dinner, and I could tell she was nervous. She was changing here, and wouldn't show me her dress until it was time to go. We were taking my truck, which was normal for us. She knew about my anxiety about car accidents, and she was perfectly comfortable with the truck. Since I bought the truck after the accident, I'd gotten it with entry assist steps on both sides, so I wasn't as concerned about her modesty in a dress as I might have been otherwise. I was instructed to go get into my suit for the evening, and she took over the guest room to get ready, apply makeup, and start on her hair. I was dressed in about 15 minutes, but she took over an hour, and I thought it was a waste of time. She could come out in a poncho made from a trash bag, with no makeup, and she was still the most beautiful woman I could imagine. I wisely didn't suggest that though, contenting myself that she would look beautiful no matter what she was wearing. When she was ready, I mentally kicked myself. You look like royalty, I told her. She was wearing a red dress, and she'd made her hair and makeup look like she had the power to execute workers who displeased her. I couldn't see the makeup on her. I didn't know what she'd done, but it was flawless. She looked like herself idealized. You always take my breath away, but tonight, you've gone to a whole new level. She smiled dazzlingly and twirled. For my inspection, I was a lucky SOB, and I had no idea how I was going to keep my hands off her all night. So I compromised. I didn't mess up her makeup. I wrapped my arms around her and held her. She felt so good in my arms that I didn't want to go to dinner, but we eventually locked the apartment and I held her door for her, helping her up into the truck, since her heels weren't meant for the climb. I stole frequent glances at her as we stopped at lights, but I turned into a hawk when the light turned green. I'd learned about distractions while driving. She could see the anxiety in my body language, and the look she gave me when we parked at the restaurant was sympathetic. I smiled and got out to come around and get her door. I took her hand as she climbed down from the truck, thinking that I might want to look into something a little lower for occasions like this. We'd made reservations for tonight, and the restaurant was something well outside of where either of us normally ate, but we'd both wanted tonight to be special. I didn't tell her that the dollar menu at Burger King would have been just as special to me if I was out with her, but I think she knew. We were pampering each other tonight. Dinner was fabulous, and I had to admit that they had BK on the ropes. We were just leaving when I saw a familiar face entering the restaurant. Hello, Chloe, I said quietly. It's been a long time. She took me in from the bottom of my cane to the top of my haircut and smiled. Hello, she said. Have you been? She asked, coming to hug me thinking that I was an industry contact. The cane had been a present from Eve, and she said she'd picked it up for a song at a storage locker auction she went to. It was ornate and black, inlaid with mother of pearl and carved intricately. There were small semi-precious gemstones and gold accents. It was suitable for formal occasions, and this was its maiden voyage. It's been, oh, how long? I smiled and hugged her back. She was 17 now, and I wondered if she was still a menace. New Year's Eve, I reminded her of when we met. I must have passed out shortly after we ran into each other, but it was that kind of party. She stiffened when she realized that I was the person she'd hit, and when she pulled back, there was worry on her face. I smiled at her reassuringly. Let me introduce you to my girlfriend. Chloe Sinclair, this is Lori Johnson. They exchanged pleasantries, with Chloe recovering a little now that she knew she wasn't gonna get my cane wrapped around her head. She bit her lip and looked at me sheepishly. How have you been since the accident? She asked delicately. I shrugged. It took a long time to get here, but life is starting to feel like it's worth living again. I told her and then looked at Lori. That's her doing. Have you told her about the accident? She asked. No, when the settlement was reached, I promised not to. She has to marry me before I can tell her. I smiled at Lori. Chloe stunned me when she told her. I was the one that hit Mr. Hamilton, she said. I was scared and drunk and a little high, and I was running from the cops when the accident happened. She turned to me and looked worried all over again. I wanted to apologize from the first day, she said. The lawyers told me to say nothing and admit nothing, though. They were trying to see if they could fix it. I nodded. Lawyers are picky like that, I told her. Thank you for saying it now. I appreciate it. I don't want you to worry about it, though. I know you didn't mean for any of it to happen. I really didn't want her to agonize over it. How have you been since then? I heard that you had some injuries, too. She laughed mirthlessly. A nosebleed and a sore wrist, she said. I stopped drinking after that night. I heard that you'd first wanted me to do rehab and volunteer with a charity to fight drunk driving. I actually started doing that, she said. The volunteering, that is. I realized that I'd almost killed someone. If I'd been going a little faster. She shook her head. I'm glad you're doing better, I told her sincerely. I'm thrilled that you're helping others too. She smiled and thanked me. It was nice seeing you, she said when she was told that her table was ready. I'm glad you're feeling better. She kissed me on the cheek and then told Lori that she must be a miracle worker to get me back on my feet. We said goodbye and then walked back to the truck. I held her door and then got in behind the wheel. So you got put in a coma by a Hollywood starlet, huh? She asked when we were settled. I nodded. I'd have told you, but the terms of the settlement included a non-disclosure agreement. That's okay, she assured me. It's interesting that she told me, though. I think she was looking to make amends, I admitted. I was surprised, but pleased. After dinner, we had tickets to a comic at a local venue, and then we were going to try dancing a little. I was hopeful that I could still take to the dance floor. The comedian was funny, but a little flat, like he had his material down to a science and was phoning it in, but the dancing went better than I could have hoped. My leg cooperated and Lori wasn't an avid dancer, so my mistakes were mostly glossed over. I gave her my all, even if my all was less than I wanted it to be. We danced and laughed and fell deeper in love with each other. We drove back to the apartment, and I held her close as we stood just inside the closed door. I don't want tonight to end, I admitted. You make me feel so much more alive than I can remember feeling. I crave that feeling when I have to share you with the world. She blushed beautifully at that and melted in my arms. I've got tomorrow off, she confided. We don't have to call it a night. She punctuated her statement by nibbling on my earlobe. I shivered in response and ran my hands over her back. You always say the sweetest things to me. I whispered back to her and started kissing her neck, intoxicated from her perfume and her shampoo and the scent beneath it all that was just her. I love you so much, I breathed in her ear. I love you too, she told me, and I felt her fingers stroking my neck gently as we necked softly. She started to push my suit jacket off my shoulders, and I let it slide to the floor readily enough. I reached for the clasp on her dress, but she spun out of my arms nimbly. Ah, she chided with a smile on her face before she returned to me. She loosened my tie and pulled it off, tossing it aside and beckoning me to follow her. She unbuttoned my shirt and kicked off her shoes while she led me toward the bedroom. I realized that she was leaving a trail of clothes across the apartment. You leaving clothes everywhere for a reason? I asked playfully. It's fun to think of someone stopping by and seeing clothes everywhere, she told me and pushed my shirt down my arms, dropping it right there at the entrance to the hall. She surveyed her handiwork and frowned. It needs something. A red dress? I asked with a smile. She nodded. I think that's the next step. She turned her back and gathered her hair over her shoulder so I could unzip her dress. Help a girl out? She asked coyly. I stepped up and started to nuzzle her neck as I opened the clasp and drew the zipper down. You get to place this one, she said. I looked around the living room and then tossed it into the kitchen, letting it spread over the table like a newspaper. She looked at it and nodded her approval. Perfect, she said, and my attention was drawn back to her. She was a goddess. I hungered for her, and I wrapped my arms around her, wanting to feel her skin against mine. She came to me just as eagerly, her lips seeking out mine as we poured our lust into each other. She groaned and tangled her fingers in my hair, pulling my head back. Take me to bed first, she said. That can't be comfortable for you. She helped me up and we opened the door, ending our trail of clothes. Her stockings and garter belt would decorate the room later, but now, I liked them where they were. She pushed me back onto the bed and I settled myself in the middle of the bed while she climbed on with me. I thought I was in heaven to this point. We had wild sex. 2:30 long? I asked knowingly. She nodded. Jeff used to do it. I laughed and cuddled her close. Another way we're different, I said. She growled pleasantly at that thought and kissed me again. You'll get your chance to get back there, soldier, she told me, using her pet name for me. We stayed like that for a while, holding each other and gazing at each other with affection. I told her that I loved her, and she said the same. Our embrace became more tender, with her lying comfortably on top of me. She smiled warmly and shifted slightly, adjusting our position so we were more relaxed. She leaned in close and kissed me gently, then sat up with a calm expression. "Just relax," she said, offering a reassuring smile. She placed her hands on my chest, a gesture of care and warmth as we locked eyes. The connection between us was undeniable, a deep sense of shared love and trust filling the room. Her movements were deliberate, as if she was savoring every moment, and I could feel the depth of her emotions mirrored in her gaze. I reached up, lightly brushing my hands against her shoulders, appreciating her presence and the bond we shared. The energy in the room grew as she leaned forward again, our foreheads touching as we both smiled, lost in the sheer happiness of being together. Her expression was one of pure love and contentment, and I knew it matched my own. This was a moment of unity, one that reflected the years we had both waited for something this genuine. It was as if time had stopped, leaving only us in the warmth of the connection we had found together. She collapsed into my arms, both of us gasping for breath and holding onto each other, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. We were trembling, shaken by the strength of our emotions. "We need a shower," she whispered softly. "I don't want to move, but I think it's time." I nodded, and we got up reluctantly. When we got out of the shower, we returned to bed and curled up with each other. She made a contented sigh and snuggled in cutely. "You know, Jeff and I never got to do this," she told me. "We wanted to, but it was too much risk. You're the first man I'll ever sleep with. You'll probably be the only one." I stroked her hair gently. "I've slept with a couple of women," I told her. "Only had sex with one of them, but that was only once." "Linda?" she asked. "Yeah. We got a hotel room for my prom," I confessed. "I guess it was only a couple of weeks later that she started cheating on me with Bill." "You're really not angry about it anymore?" she asked. "Not at all," I said. "If I was a pig, I'd suggest that Mike should be the angry one. He's the only one of the three of us that she didn't screw." She laughed at that. "Shame she didn't get the whole set," she giggled. "She'll have to deal with Mary on that one," I said with a laugh of my own. "I think she'd claw Linda's face off if she suggested it." She shrugged. "So how close are you with all of them?" she asked. "Mike's the one I'm close to, but I'm on speaking terms with the rest of them now. It's a little weird in some ways. Linda calls me most." "You think she's hoping to get back together?" she asked. "No, she's married to Bill and they have a daughter together," I told her. "She's years too late to rekindle the passion." "So the only girl I have to worry about is Chloe Sinclair?" she asked playfully, nipping my chin with her teeth. I laughed. "She's still jailbait for one thing, and she nearly killed me for another," I said dismissively. "She also has a career to think about. When she dates, it's to make headlines." She shrugged. "She's young, pretty, rich and famous," she pointed out. "She's also immature, vain, spoiled and shallow," I countered. "You're still years younger than I am. You're gorgeous in a way that Chloe needs a makeup technician and special lighting to come close to. I did well enough in the settlement that I'm doing okay, so I'm not attracted to the extreme wealth. The fame doesn't stir my soul either. I only need attention from you. The rest of the world can get their entertainment somewhere else." She nodded. "That's a good answer, soldier," she told me softly, and we started to drift off, whispering occasionally and just basking in the glow of being together. I closed my eyes in the dark and was filled with contentment. "Wakey, wakey, eggs and baccy," came a chipper voice next to my ear, making me jump. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing the room in golden light. I raised my head reluctantly, ready to strangle the owner of that cheery voice. Lori was still sleeping contentedly, spooned against my chest, so that woke me up in a hurry. I pulled away from her gently, and she whimpered in complaint, but never woke as I slipped out of bed and looked around for the source of my rude awakening. Sabrina grinned at me and glanced at Lori. "Took you long enough," she said with a giggle. "Come on, let's go talk." "She's not ready to wake up yet." I followed her out to the kitchen. She took in the clothes strewn all over the apartment and shook her head. "What if your mother dropped by unannounced?" she asked, clicking her tongue in mock disappointment. "She'd probably be thrilled that I wasn't alone and she'd start making plans for more grandchildren," I said dryly. She thought about that and nodded. "Probably," she agreed. "So would my parents, at this point. Tell them I said hi." "I always do." I smiled and took a seat. She came to sit across from me, Lori's dress draped between us across the table. "Good. Sue," she said, smiling. "Tell me about her." I nodded and told her about Lori. I told her about her brother and my resemblance to him, how he died and how we'd fallen in love at first sight. I told her that I'd shared everything with her and that she'd done the same with me. Does she make you happy? She asked, her head cocked to one side as she looked at me. You know she does, I said. You wouldn't be here if she was just a fling. She nodded. You know me so well, she shrugged. Now you get the chance to know her that well? You want to know a secret? You make her the same kinds of happy. Any you know this how? I asked, amused. A lot of little things, she said. She's marking her territory, flinging clothes all over the place. She also looks at you like you're the second coming. I guess with her brother looking like you. Maybe she thinks you are. I get the sense that she hasn't been moving on from that, sort of like a certain someone I know. She looked at me pointedly. You two have the chance to be best friends, lovers, soulmates, and live the kind of life you always wanted. I may also have an inside source that tells me about her. I nodded, remembering Sabrina's declaration that she couldn't make me happy, only hurt me now that she was gone. I love her, I said simply. I feel like I'm starting to live life again. Go with that feeling, she said firmly. Come see me when you're in Denver. I know you'll be there eventually. You've got a couple of options for a place to stay between Linda and your brother, your parents and my folks. They worry about you, you know? I know. They came to see me after the accident. Turns out that I ended up not dead after all. You told me so. She shrugged dismissively. An educated guess. She smiled a little. How are you doing since the crash? My hip bothers me some, I admitted. They tell me that I'll have difficulty sitting in one position for long. That sort of killed my job prospects for the future, but we'll see. I'm okay financially and Lori gives me something to look forward to every day. She nodded. You never made me breakfast. She pouted a little. That day was coming, I assured her. If we'd been driving a bigger vehicle, I might have gotten my chance. You might. She agreed and looked around. You know this is goodbye for us, right? She asked. The hell? It is. I shook my head. There's times that I'll want to talk to my guardian angel. When I get married, when I have kids, when we buy our first house. She smiled. No, you'll be fine. You've needed me until now, but I think I have something else that I need to do. Oh? I asked. What's new in your life? She smiled. I don't have a life, Peter, she reminded me. You'll understand, but I won't be back. This isn't to push you to live life. That's done. You're where you're supposed to be. It's for me. She smirked and reached under the table. I'll return this to you now, she told me, putting a very familiar bottle on the table on top of Lori's dress. Lori will definitely keep you from going too crazy with it. She stood up and I stood with her. I still haven't heard what's taking you away, I reminded her. I glanced down the hall, and there was someone coming out of my bedroom. It was like looking into a mirror. He was broader in the shoulders than I was and had a more serious look to his face. Jeff? I asked, taking in the dress uniform. He nodded and came to join us, offering me his hand. Take care of Lori for me? He asked. No, I told him, taking his hand. I'll take care of her for me, just like she'll take care of me for her, not for Sabrina. He nodded and told me that was fair. Then he took Sabrina's hand and I understood why she wouldn't be back. Make each other happy, I told them both, smiling and settling into a sense of peace with how things had happened. And come see the kids when they're born. They'll be your nieces and nephews. Sabrina laughed and pulled the beret from Jeff's head. She tossed it on the table. We'll see you again, she said. Not for a long time, though. You've got a lot of years before we can double date. I chuckled and then they were gone. I looked at the door after they'd left and shook my head. I walked back to the bedroom and climbed into bed with Lori. I closed my eyes and wrapped her up in my arms. Was it real? Had it happened? Was it just my mind connecting events and telling my conscious self what I needed to hear? Did it matter? I drifted off to sleep contentedly and wondered as I was going under whether I was actually awake or just dreaming I was falling asleep. I woke up when Lori shifted to get up. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her back down, making her squeak. I need to pee. She told me urgently. I'll cuddle all you want, but I really have to go. I let her go and decided that I needed to go too. I got up and followed her to the bathroom. Coming to watch? She asked me with a look on her face. I've never watched a girl go, I admitted. I need to pee too. She wiped and got up, washing her hands while I went. I flushed and took her place at the sink. I've never watched a guy pee before, she admitted. Not even on the long hikes with Jeff? I asked her, surprised. No, he couldn't go if someone was watching, she giggled a little. I nodded. Most guys are like that. I had to share a bathroom with two brothers, so it was never a big deal. I got cleaned up and we decided that we were done sleeping for the day. We went out to the kitchen and Lori stopped, the smile fading from her face as she looked at the table. Sitting in the middle of the table, on top of her dress was a half-empty bottle of tequila and an army beret. I'd half expected them to be here, but their appearance answered all my questions. We had some visitors through the night, I explained. Remember me telling you about Sabrina taking the bottle from me when she first came to visit? That's the bottle. And the beret? She asked, not moving. Your brother looked in on you while I talked to Sabrina. You didn't dream of him? She shrugged. Yeah, but I thought it was just a dream. He was walking. He normally has the chair in my dreams. I nodded. They won't be back, I told her. Last night was goodbye. Why? She asked. Because we found each other, I told her, and because they found each other. Whatever comes after this life, they're spending it together. They'll see us when we're ready to become permanent residents, but they trust that we'll take care of each other until then. She nodded slowly and then went to the table and picked up the beret, holding it in her hands. She lifted it to her nose and smelled it with her eyes closed. She looked at me in wonder. It's his, she confirmed. It smells like him. She looked inside and found his name stenciled on the inside and put it down on the table to come and hug me. I held her and noticed that she was trembling slightly. She'd heard the stories, but this was the first time that she'd been certain that life didn't stop when our heart did. It was a powerful moment for her. She was given the certainty that not only was her brother in some afterlife, but that he wasn't damned for his suicide, like some faiths believed. He was happy and whole and at peace. She cried a little, and I cried with her. I was past any sorrow for Sabrina. My tears were happiness for her and Jeff, my own happiness and sympathy for Lori's moment of release. When she was calm again, I sat her down and started breakfast. Today, I was going for something special. I chopped up strawberries into the batter for waffles, and then took the rest of the package and crushed them in a bowl, mashing them with a fork and adding some sugar to sweeten them a little more. I made her waffle first, and when it was done, I put it on a plate and covered it with a scoop of vanilla ice cream, whipped cream, and drizzled the crushed strawberries over the top before dusting it with powdered sugar. I brought it to the table, and she looked at it like I was crazy. Is this breakfast or dessert? She blurted. I handed her a fork and shrugged. Why choose? I challenged her and kissed her. I brought her coffee to her, and she started to eat skeptically while I prepared my own. She got 2 bites in and was hooked. Oh my God. She moaned with pleasure as she devoured the whole thing. I smiled at her and noticed that she was eyeing my plate with interest. I traded with her and went to make a third waffle with an amused chuckle. I got to eat that one, but she was loud in her praise of the whole thing. I'm destined to be fat if you don't stop feeding me like this, she complained, holding her stomach and trying to determine if she was already putting on weight. They're not all that bad, I said. How about I promise to only feed you one per day? I couldn't handle this kind of breakfast every day. She shook her head. Maybe on my day off for a treat, she suggested, and that's what we did. I'd make them with every kind of fruit I could think of, but sometimes I only topped the waffle with it instead of mixing it into the batter. I think I have a lot of phone calls to make today, I told her. A fair few people know the story of that tequila bottle. They'll want to know how it turned out. Have you told them about me? She asked. Another good reason to make some calls, I said. I wasn't telling anyone until I was sure we were serious. She nodded. I have to talk to my parents to let them know. They may have a heart attack when they see you. She was dreading those questions. I know what you mean, I told her. Everyone I know is going to have a heart attack when they see you. Why? Do I look like Sabrina? She asked. No. You look like you should be a supermodel, I told her. Sabrina was beautiful, but you're stunning. You're sitting here with no makeup on, and you look like you could be on the cover of a magazine. Yeah, Penthouse, she joked, looking down at her naked body. I've seen worse-looking women on the cover, I told her seriously. I've never seen a better-looking one, though. Flatterer, she said with a smile. There are plenty of better-looking women on magazine covers. I shrugged. I think you're crazy, but then again, I'm admittedly biased. We bantered like that back and forth for a little while, and then I decided that it was late enough for me to make the first of my phone calls to spread the news. I called Rosa first. Ham, she said when she answered the phone. I had her on speaker and Lori mouthed the word questioningly at me. How's my Texas mom? I asked, in good spirits. I'm just sitting down after the breakfast dishes, she said. What's on your mind? You don't normally call this early. Something happened that prompted me to start making calls, I told her. When I got up this morning, there was a half-empty bottle of tequila on my kitchen table. I thought you stopped drinking the hard. She trailed off and gasped. The bottle she took? The very same, I told her. She decided that it was time to return it. Why now? She asked. You said she was holding on to it because she didn't want you drinking like you were. She didn't want me holding on to the past anymore, I reminded her. She wanted me to find someone to move forward with. Have you? She asked excitedly. I have, I told her. Her name is Lori. She's amazing. She's here with me. She screamed in excitement, and I was struck by how badly she'd wanted this for me. That's such good news, Ham. She gushed. Can I talk to her? We're on speaker, I told her. The two of us had gone back to bed, and were curled up together with the phone in my lap. Hi, Lori said shyly. Peter's told me a lot about you, she said. Oh, sweetie, Rosa said. I'm so happy to meet you. I can't wait to see the two of you face to face. I've been hoping some lucky girl would sweep him off his feet. He was actually in a hospital bed when we met, she confided. I'm a nurse where he had his last surgery. They gushed like that for half an hour, Rosa telling her stories of my time in Austin and Lori telling her about herself and about the things we do together. No, not those things. That did come up, but in general terms, and I got rave reviews from Lori and a promise to make me perform again and again. Rosa was thrilled to death and told me that she was planning on coming up to see us in a few weeks once her new students were settled in. Lizzie's gonna be beside herself, she said. Just let her know to keep it to herself, I cautioned. We have a lot of people to tell, and she knows a few of the same people. I will, she promised, and then we hung up. So she was your landlady? She asked skeptically, smirking at me. I nodded. We became very close, I said solemnly. She's also the woman that I slept with, but didn't have sex. She nodded. That's gotta be a story, she prompted me. I told her about the last night I'd had in Austin and putting her to bed. You didn't take advantage? She asked with a smirk. Nah, I said. Don't get me wrong, Rosa is an attractive woman, but she had drawn the line, and if she wouldn't cross it while sober, I wouldn't cross it either. She nodded and gave me a reassuring pat. Good soldier, she commented with a light laugh. After that, we called my mother, who was overjoyed, though I think she was just happy to hear from me. I hoped Pierce was similarly glad when I shared the news with her. I relayed Sabrina's message, telling her that she was moving on too. I'm sure she'll keep an eye on us, but it seems like it's time for her to enjoy some peace. Hope had always delighted in my visits from her daughter, and her sharply honed attention caught that I was being delicate about something. There's something you're not telling me, she said. Spill it. Fair enough, I said. Lori had a brother. He died some time ago. He looks a lot like me. Two people with guardian angels meet and fall in love. What do their angels do when they suddenly find themselves not having to worry about the living? So they just walk off into the sunset together? She asked, considering that possibility. They do and they have, I told her. Lori was holding on to me tightly. We were both feeling remarkably calm. We'd been watched over by these two people that had been the center of our worlds for so long that it was a big change. Yet I didn't feel adrift, like I had when she died and again after she'd taken the bottle and left. She'd passed her burden back to the living, and it was beautiful, touching, humbling, and perfect. We talked about it between phone calls and Lori, and I felt the same. It was almost like having a father give her away on her wedding day. We were in each other's hands now. Hope sniffed a little at that, but I could tell from the sound of her voice when she spoke that she was happy. I'm so glad that you found someone who makes you happy, she said. I'm glad she has too. Well, she doesn't want any of us to worry about her, I said. We'll always remember her, but she's happy where she is. Are you? Does this mean we won't hear from you as much? She asked reluctantly. God, no, I said. Your family. Nothing changes that. Good, she said, sounding relieved. We'll want you to come visit us. You haven't done that yet. I know Denver isn't your favorite place, but we want to meet your new lady. As soon as she can get some time away from work, we'll come to see everyone, I promised. Next week, Lori barged into the middle of the conversation. I have some time off that I need to take or it expires. I already booked some of it, so we'll be able to come Wednesday or Thursday, she said. I looked at her, surprised, and then laughed. We'll see you next week, I said, sounding surprised. I guess so, Hope laughed. Sounds like she's gonna keep you on your toes. We hung up after that, and I admitted that I was out of calls to make for a few hours until Mike and Mary were home. My turn then, she said confidently, getting out of bed to grab her phone. She quickly returned and snuggled in, giving me a kiss before dialing the number and putting the phone on speaker. Hi, Lori, a friendly voice greeted us. What's got you calling this early in the day? Hi, Mom, she replied sweetly. I wanted to talk to you, and I hope Dad was around. It's lunchtime there, right? Your father's at the table now, her mother said. He's about to head into town, though. I'll put you on speaker so we can all chat. She paused for a moment, and then a beep signaled that we were speaking to the whole room. Hi, Pumpkin, her father said. sounding like someone that was normally gruff and businesslike with anyone except his daughter. I smiled about that, but kept quiet until I was introduced. "What's on your mind?" "Hi, Daddy," she said, clearly displaying the soft spot she had for him. "I wanted to talk to you both. I know you sometimes worry about me, and I have a piece of news that I think might help you worry less." "You're coming home?" her dad asked hopefully, his voice barely containing his excitement. "No, Daddy," she said and then contradicted herself. "Well, yes, but only for a visit. We'll get to that though. I met someone." "You mean like a boy?" her mother asked tentatively. "At my age, I think they're called men. But yes, I met a nice young man," she said with a giggle, brimming with enthusiasm. "A California boy?" her father asked, not exactly as thrilled with the prospect as my calls had turned out. "No, Dad," she said, exasperated. "He's from Denver. He's also lived in Texas and Alabama for a while." "So, he moves around a lot?" Her father sounded less enthused with each piece of news. "He's not a drifter, Dad," she said dryly. "He's a computer expert." "Oh, that's interesting," her mother said, taking the reins. "How did you two meet?" "He was in the hospital," Lori told her parents. "He was in a bad car accident and was in for surgery afterwards." "So, he was a patient?" came the slightly disappointed question from her mother. I was silently laughing as they tried to get a picture of me in their head. "It's not that dramatic, Mom," Lori said. "All his recovery is done. He was in for scar reduction surgery after they'd finished with all the reconstructive work." "So you met him in the hospital and started dating from there?" her father asked. "What's he like?" "He's smart and funny and kind. We were out last night, and we met the woman that hit him. He was nice to her and introduced me just like she was an old friend. It would have been easy for him to ignore her or be mean to her, but he treated her well and asked about her health after the crash." "Well, that's certainly a nice way to treat her," her mother admitted. "What else can you tell me about him?" "He's worked in construction," she said. "His brothers and his father still do. He put himself through college, and he adores me." "Of course he adores you." Her father broke in like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Tell us something about him, though." "This isn't his first car accident," she said. 3 years ago, he was a passenger when the car he was in was hit pretty badly. His girlfriend at the time died right there with him. It took a long time for him to get over her. He drives a pretty big truck because he feels like it's safer than smaller cars after he lived through his accident, and she didn't make it through hers. "That's a terrible tragedy," her mother said, sounding more subdued. "It is," Lori agreed. "I guess the most important thing about him is that I love him and he makes me happy. We sort of found each other." "What's his name?" her father asked. "Peter," she said. "Would you like to talk to him?" "He's there with you?" her mother asked, surprised. "Yep. Ask all the questions you want. Say hello, Pete." "Hi, folks," I said, hoping that they wouldn't hate me on first contact. "Hello, Peter," Mr. Johnson said. "Lori tells us that you've been in a car accident recently. How are you feeling?" "Mostly recovered at this point," I told them. "It happened on New Year's Eve, so I've had time to recover about as much as can be expected." "So you're going to be permanently injured?" he asked, and I smiled, thinking he was trying to assess whether I'd be a burden to his daughter or not. "I hope that my recovery will continue until I recover fully, but I'm held together in places with pins and screws, so I'll probably get to keep some of the limp for the long term. My mind is still sharp though, and I'm as good with my hands as I ever was." "You've certainly managed to make an impression on our daughter," he said. "What are your intentions?" "Gordon," his wife snapped. "This isn't an interrogation. Be nice." "It's okay, ma'am," I assured her. "It's a fair question. After all, you're just hearing about me for the first time. It's only fair that you want to know if I'm interested in Lori for the short term or the long term." "And which is it?" her father prompted me. "Definitely long term," I told them. "I know more than most that sometimes we don't have as much time in the world as we'd like. I want to spend every minute of that time with Lori, though." "You're serious about him, Pumpkin?" her father asked, unconvinced. "Yes, Dad," she told him seriously. "How many times have I called you to tell you I met someone?" "Never," he admitted. "That's what makes this so startling. You didn't even date seriously in high school. So getting a phone call out of the blue to introduce us to someone is a little unexpected. I'm sure we'll seem less disapproving once we get used to the idea, but this is a lot to take in." "It's okay," she said. "I just wanted you to know. I'm sure that you'll want to meet him sooner or later. We're going to take a trip to Colorado to see his folks next week. You want us to try to come up to see you, or would you rather wait until closer to the holidays?" "You've got some time off?" her mother asked, perking up. "I have to take a bunch of my banked vacation before the start of the year or I'll lose it. So I'm going to take 2 weeks now and another 2 weeks off at Christmas time. We'd love to see you, dear, she gushed. When can you come? We'll have to see when we can get a flight up there and back, Lori said. Let us look over the reservations website and we'll see what day looks best. We'll have to make up Jeff's old room for Peter, she said after a moment's hesitation. Ma'am, Lori's told me about what happened to Jeff. If you'd prefer that I not disturb his room, we can figure something else out, I said, hoping to cut down on the anxiety that I could hear in the air. No, she said. It's just that we haven't had anyone in that room since he passed, she said quietly. Mom, don't touch anything in there, Lori told her. Just tidy up like you did when he came home from deployment. You'll want Peter to stay in that room, she said firmly. That's what I was planning to do, dear, she said. You call us back when you know when you can be here. After that awkward call was over, we settled down. It was at least several hours before we could call any of the rest of my family. We decided to go to the beach since it was gorgeous out. A few hours of us swimming and I was tired. My hip wasn't as bad as it could have been, but one look at Lori in her bikini had me thinking very ungentlemanly thoughts. Enjoying the show? She asked after the third time. She caught me staring at her. God, yes. I breathed, unashamed at being caught staring. We did all the fun things at the beach. I rubbed sunscreen into her smooth skin, and she did the same for me. We swam, got ice cream, which she promptly smeared all over my face, making me chase her. There was no way I could really catch her, but she let me anyway. We swam some more to wash off the residue after she licked most of it from my face. Mostly, we just spent the day being in love. We got back to the apartment and showered, not bothering with clothes as we camped out in the living room. We turned on the TV and turned the volume down low before we started making calls. Hi, Pete, Mary said when she answered the phone. How was your last surgery? Hi, Mary, I said. I'm doing okay. How are things out there? Hectic, she admitted. Mike's just coming in with dinner. You want to talk to him? I want to talk to both of you actually, I said and waited for her to put me on speaker. Hey, little brother, Mike said, and I could hear the kids scampering around. What's new in the land of Hollywood? I ran into Chloe Sinclair last night. I told them with a smirk, knowing they'd latch onto that news. Did you kick her butt? Mary asked. I'll be happy to pay your bail if you did. No, I was very pleasant. We met in passing at a restaurant and caught up. She said she was starting to get her life together and is volunteering. I introduced her to my girlfriend, and then we went our separate ways. That's nice too. What? Mike said, making the two of us laugh. You introduced her to your what? I met someone. Ironically, I would never have met her if not for the accident, I told them. She's a nurse and her name is Lori. I woke up in recovery and there she was. That's great, Pete, Mary told me. I could hear the relief in her voice. Maybe I really should have been paying more attention to how much people worried about my love life. It sounded like I'd been a topic of conversation throughout the family. What's she like? She's an angel, I said. Don't take my word for it, though. She's right here. Hi, Lori said, her voice sounding like music to me. Hi, they both said, and then Mary shooed Mike off to get the kids cleaned up for dinner. Has Pete had a chance to tell you much about the family? She asked delicately. He told me a lot, she said. I know about Sabrina and about his brother, Bill. We talked to his mother and Sabrina's mother earlier. We've made a point of telling each other our life stories. Did he tell you all about Sabrina? She asked delicately. I wish I could have gotten to meet her, Lori said. She left before I woke up this morning, though. She what? Mary asked. Sabrina stopped by to visit. She said it was goodbye. She also left me a present. You remember that bottle that disappeared after she came to see me in Texas? Yeah, you said you never found it. Are you telling me that she brought it back? It was on the table when we woke up this morning. You two spent the night together? Oh, this gets better and better. You're sure it was the same bottle? I haven't had another bottle since that night, I told her. So she approves of Lori then? She asked. Oh, there's a lot more to it than that, but she's happy that I'm happy and she's gonna focus on herself. We talked for a few more minutes and we let them go eat. We had a similar conversation with Linda and Bill. Though I wasn't as close to Bill, I didn't really hold any animosity toward him. They were both surprised and thrilled at the news. We decided to make dinner together and then sit down to plan our trip. We were going to Denver for 4 nights and then flying to Minneapolis to spend some time with her folks. We were a little unsure how long we wanted to stay there. They seemed a little unsure of me and I hoped they'd warm up to me, but we bought the tickets one way so we could stay or leave as the situation demanded. That done, we called her parents back and told them, and then called back to Hope and Carl Pierce, so they'd know when we were coming and also so that Carl could say hello to Lori. I had one more person that I needed to talk to, so I picked up the phone and called Eve. She congratulated me and was already looking up Lori's information before we hung up. She's gorgeous. She blurted out, having found her Facebook page. How did you end up with her? I was extremely lucky and don't know it. I laughed while Lori started kissing my neck, looking to lure me away from the phone. I think I need to go for now, I told her, letting myself get distracted. Call me for lunch tomorrow, I suggested, and she let me go with some laughter. Once I was off the phone, Lori sat down next to me, wrapping her arms around me as she leaned in for a deep kiss. I held her close and told her how much I loved her as we shared a quiet moment together on the sofa. She rested her head on my chest, and I embraced her, feeling a strong connection. I was thinking about you earlier at the beach, she admitted. Seeing you look at me like that made me feel closer to you. I groaned as she spoke, whispering that I loved her and had wanted to be with her in that moment, right there in front of everyone. She sighed softly, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she held me close, her body trembling with emotion. She rested her head against mine, and I could feel her heart racing. I struggled to control my own emotions, trying to hold back, wanting to stay in the moment with her. She responded with a soft, contented hum, and I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the connection we shared. In that moment, I realized how much she had brought me back to life, how much she had revived something inside me that I hadn't known was missing. Stay with me, I breathed. Tonight, tomorrow, forever. That sounds perfect, she murmured against my neck. Are you asking me to move in? She nipped my skin playfully as we slowly woke up. You already live here, I said softly. We just need to fix it so that you don't have to leave to get clothes. She bit her lip and nodded. Okay, should I bring furniture, or does it matter? She asked. Anything you think we need, I told her. If your couch is nicer, we'll replace this. Same with everything. I think I have a nicer dinette set, she admitted and looked around. I've got a nice recliner that you might want to spend some time in. Your bed is much better than mine. I'll show you after work tomorrow. I nodded and thought that life couldn't possibly get any better than this. Shows what I know. We went to bed after another shower and didn't make love again, but held each other lovingly, reveling in having found each other. The next morning, I made us breakfast and saw her off to work with her lunch in her hand and a kiss fresh on her lips. I spent the morning working around the apartment, preparing it for its new occupant. I repacked the drawers in the bedroom, made room in the bathroom, and a few other little things that I thought would help. She was coming back here, and then we were going to her place to start moving her stuff. Eve called about 11, and we went to lunch at a local food truck we both loved. One great thing about LA, there's a food truck for literally any taste. This one dealt in German sausage, and it was always good. They served their sausage on buns similar to hot dogs, but they were so much better. We took ours and sat on a bench nearby, taking a few minutes to get the initial hunger out of the way before we talked. So you went into the hospital and found the hottest nurse in 1,000 miles, she said around a mouthful of sausage. What the hell? Like, how did you manage that? You have blackmail material on her? Nope. We ran into Chloe Sinclair the other night though. I have blackmail material on. Thank you for that. I don't think I'm gonna release it though. If you do, that's cool. It was you that managed to get into her computer to begin with. She shrugged. Nah, I hear she's doing better now. I'd still have to wait a year before I could release anything anyway. She's still only 17. When she was the bitch princess, I could get behind putting her teenage, but out for the vultures to fight over. I heard she went into rehab, and she's doing something with her fame, volunteering for a few charities. I nodded. She told me. I think the accident scared her straight. I hope so, at least. She shrugged. It'd be nice if that was true, she said. You're changing the subject though. How'd you manage to land the hottest damn woman I've ever seen? Honestly, I said. A combination of my looks and charm, I told her. It was essentially true, but I was trolling her just a little. Bullshit, she called. You're no Quasimodo, but you're not GQ material either. You could pass for a Marlboro man if you put on the Stetson, but you're not in her league for looks. I shrugged. You didn't do a full digital cavity search on her? I asked, surprised. I figured you'd have found out what cut and color panties she wore. Blue boy shorts, she deadpanned. Just save me the search and tell me. You're dying to anyway. I can smell the smugness on you. She had a brother, I told her. He was a soldier, but got hurt in Iraq and couldn't adjust to life without legs. I look a little like him. Okay, that was a lie. I looked a lot like him. She gave me a look of pity. So she latched onto you because of her brother? I thought you were smarter than that. As soon as she figures out that you're not her brother back from the dead, your relationship is done. You know that, right? I'd agree. If that was the only thing that was holding her attention, I told her. She said that there's a lot about me that's vastly different from him. He could never laugh at himself, and there's so much to laugh at me for that it's sometimes hard to choose just one. He hated computers, loved his painkillers, and I don't even know what else, but she mentions it all the time. I think she's trying to reassure me that I'm not just a stand-in for him. She shrugged. I still think she's seeing a dead man walking, she said. My advice would be to enjoy the ride while it lasts, and then have a backup plan for when it comes apart. I nodded. That's good advice, I told her. But you're not going to take it, she finished. On the contrary, I laughed. I intend to enjoy every minute of my time with Lori. My backup plan for when she leaves is to lean on our kids and grandkids until it's time for me to go to her. Oh, God, you're hopeless, she groaned. But she laughed a little too. I get what you're saying, I told her. There's something else that happened that tells me that she's not going to go down that spiral. Oh? She asked. I'm all ears. It's hard to talk about, Eve, I admitted. It's the kind of thing that either makes believers or makes the skeptics roll their eyes. Try me, she challenged me. So I told her. Sabrina. Linda's visit, the bottle, the accident, meeting Lori, dreaming about her brother and Sabrina, and waking up to find the bottle and his uniform beret on the kitchen table. Are you trying to tell me that shit happened? She asked me with a look of disbelief on her face. I nodded. She checked the name, and it was stenciled on the inside of the hat. She knew the shampoo he used and said it was his. You don't think she might have done that? She asked skeptically. And she just happened to get the brand of tequila right, and just happened to anticipate that I dream about both of them, and that they'd leave those items in my dream, so she could sneak out and plant them for me to find? If she was that good at running cons, she'd be a TV psychic or something, not a nurse. That is a lot of coincidence, she admitted. You're not shitting me, are you? She sounded like she was just realizing that I wasn't pulling her leg. Nope, I told her. This is serious like a heart attack. I told her. She was a little rattled at finding his beret there. It's like we had our guardian angels voice their approval. How do you not get serious after that? She shrugged, mulling it over. She wasn't someone who believed in that sort of thing, but at the same time, she knew I wasn't a good enough actor to sell this if it was fiction. I was never the kind of girl that bought into ghost stories or any of that bullshit, but I know you wouldn't lie about something like this. Weird. Indeed, I agreed wisely. I might, if there was a hilarious practical joke involved, or there was a damn good reason. But there's no laughs to be had here, and I can't think of a reason that I'd make something like that up. We sat quietly for a while, lost in thought. I'm happy for you, she said suddenly as we watched the lunchtime crowd descending on the food truck like a zombie apocalypse. Thanks, I said, meaning it. You know, you're probably my best friend. Your opinion means a lot to me. I'm your best friend? She asked, surprised. Yeah, I said simply. Is that so shocking? A little, she admitted. I don't think I've ever been anyone's best friend before. Not even Linda? I asked. Nah. We kept in touch because I was tracking you down for her. That's another reason that it's weird for you to call me your best friend. We didn't start out so well. I stalked you for years for someone you hated, and then stood you up twice. I shrugged. All in the past, I said lightly. To be honest, Linda coming to find me in Austin was a turning point in my life. It never would have happened if not for you. Standing me up isn't really a big deal. You weren't ready to meet me. Linda always said that you were blunt at times and it pushed people out of your life. But the truth is that you're not the problem. You're blunt, not mean. You say what's on your mind and you don't hold back. The people that took offense, they're the ones with the problem, Eve. You're a good friend. You were there for me when my accident happened, and you've been here for me since. Anybody that doesn't think you're a pretty awesome friend is stupid. Any guy that would break up with a girl as staunchly loyal as you because you didn't stroke his ego needs to get his priorities straight. You can't really appreciate loyalty until you've had someone cheat on you. She sat, turned toward me, and looked at me like she'd never seen me before. You really mean all that? She asked. I smiled and nodded. Yep, I said. As a best friend, you're pretty awesome. You taught me how to hack, supplied me with embarrassing adult videos of Hollywood, tracked down the evidence in my case, and helped me plan my revenge if things went poorly. Thanks. She smiled in awe. I've never been someone's best friend. I don't quite know what to say. Say you'll be at my wedding, I supplied with a chuckle. If it wasn't for everything Mike and I have been through, I'd ask you to stand up for me. Your best man? She asked dryly. It's not so uncommon these days to ignore gender roles. I shrugged dismissively. Yeah, but you always struck me as being more traditional, she pointed out. Not so traditional that I'd snub you, I assured her. Mike's my brother though, and after Linda cheated on me with my own brother, he was the only one that put himself on my side. He became my whole family after that. I need him there. It's cool, she said. I don't think they make tuxes in my style anyway. If he backs out though, I'll snap up his place in a heartbeat. We grinned about that, having gone from her being skeptical to the shared certainty that I was going to marry this girl. We parted after a little more chatting, and I went home to finish getting the bedroom organized for two. When Lori came home, there was a lot of hugging and kissing, and then we were off to her apartment. She talked to her landlord and informed him that she wasn't renewing her lease, which was up at the end of October. So she gave him October's rent a couple of weeks early and told him that we'd make sure the place was cleaned up and we'd do the final inspection when we were ready to hand over the keys. I'd brought some empty luggage with me, figuring that there was a good chance that she had a lot more wardrobe than her luggage could handle. It turns out that Lori had a little bit of a passion for clothes. We packed what we could and she bit her lip, looking at her closet. "I've got too much," she declared. "I'm gonna have to get rid of some things." "Well, we can go through everything once you're moved in." I soothed her anxiety. "For now, let's just pack what we can. Make sure to get what you need for the next week first, and then we'll look into the rest." She nodded, and we spent the next few hours cleaning out her apartment. She was deeply embarrassed when I opened the drawer on her nightstand and came face to face with a collection of sex toys. She'd come over to try to stop me from seeing, but I already had one in my hand. She buried her face in her hands, mortified, but I didn't see why and told her so. "It's embarrassing," she insisted. "Baby, there's no reason to feel self-conscious. You're amazing just as you are," I said gently, placing my hands on her shoulders to reassure her. She looked at me curiously, and I responded with a warm smile. "Come on, let's focus on what's next," I added, helping her adjust her scrubs as she prepared to get back to work. I could sense her surprise at the sudden shift in mood, but I gave her an encouraging pat on the shoulder and said, "You've got this." She bit her lip and let out a small sound from the constant distraction. After a moment, she nodded and we returned to packing. She moved with more determination, clearly wanting to finish quickly so she could get home. Despite her focus, the interruptions were making her a little unfocused. She would work intensely for a few minutes, then pause, overwhelmed for a moment before continuing with her task. "You're cruel," she accused me with a sigh after a few interruptions. "And you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," I told her in response. "You look stunning. I'm glad you're enjoying the moment." She blushed and paused for a few moments before getting back to her work. I made sure to pack the rest of her toy collection and thought that we might want to go shopping for more in the future. We eventually filled the bags that we had and decided to pick up dinner on the way home. She went to remove the toy from her pants and I stopped her. "Leave it," I said. "We'll pick up drive-through so you don't have to go in anywhere." She gave me an anguished look but nodded. "You're in so much trouble later, though," she said playfully. We picked up dinner from Wendy's and went home to eat. I noticed she ate about half of my fries, but that was fine. I figured I probably deserved it. Later that evening, she decided it was her turn to have some fun. She went into the bedroom to prepare and then came back to get me. With a mischievous smile, she had me lie down on the bed. Using scarves she'd found in the closet, she gently tied my wrists and ankles to the bedposts. I was a bit nervous, but I trusted her and went along with it. She seemed to enjoy taking the lead this time, teasing me and making me laugh with her playful antics. She used her creativity to keep me guessing, taking her time and clearly enjoying every moment of her revenge. I couldn't help but laugh and squirm under her care, even as I groaned and complained when she paused to tease me further. Her laughter filled the room, infectious and bright, as we both leaned into the silliness of the moment. Eventually, though, I began to feel a bit uncomfortable from being tied up for so long. She quickly noticed and stopped, her concern evident. "Are you okay?" she asked, already working to undo the knots. I nodded, though I winced as I tried to shift. She freed me carefully and checked to make sure nothing was hurt, her caring nature shining through. Once I explained what was bothering me, she couldn't help but giggle, though she tried her best to suppress it. "You're impossible," I muttered with a smirk. She wrapped her arms around me and snuggled close, the sound of her laughter soft and comforting. "I'll have to find another way to get back at you," she teased lightly. "I didn't mean to leave you feeling like this." I nodded, letting the tension fade away. Despite everything, I couldn't help but smile. Moments like these reminded me why I loved her. Her playful spirit, her warmth, and the way she turned even the simplest moments into memories to cherish. We drifted off to sleep and I was awakened the next morning to the smell of coffee. I was alone in bed and wandered out to the kitchen in search of a cup of black gold. Unfortunately, I got tar. My baby was many things. A barista was not among her skills. She came and kissed me. "The coffee's a little strong," she warned me. That was an understatement. "Gah," I said, after my first sip, feeling like my tongue had been mugged. Sugar would make it better. I prayed and dumped a liberal amount into my cup, stirring it hopefully. The coffee did wake me up, though. It's bad? She asked sheepishly. It's a lot stronger than I was expecting. I told her diplomatically and kissed her. Thanks for making it. She smiled at me, knowing that I was avoiding telling her that it could peel paint. She was bustling around the kitchen and refused to let me help. She had scrambled eggs cooking and sausage in another pan. Just sit down, she said. I'll make you breakfast for once. Okay, I said agreeably. What about your lunch? I asked. You can do that, if you want, she allowed, and I set to work, packing her something to take with her while she cooked. I hobbled off to my computer desk while she worked and write a short note that said I loved her and missed her, and came back to slip it in with her lunch while she was distracted, and packed it up with a smile on my face while she got everything to the table. The coffee was still strong enough to stand up without the mug, but other than that, everything else was fine. She had 3 more shifts before her vacation started, and we'd settled into our routine. I took her apartment keys before she left for work, so I could get to her place and continue packing. She told me to be careful not to do too much, so I promised to take it easy. Most of the day I just got things ready to move. She already had her kitchen cleaned out, and there was nothing really to do there except go through the place with her and see what she wanted to take with her from the kitchen and what we'd get rid of. Her bedroom was a different matter. She wasn't prepared to move out, so I took some time organizing things in there. I'd stopped and gotten some boxes, and I filled them as well as I could, taking them down to the truck one at a time. I poked around her apartment, emptying the bathroom and checking to see what we'd need to decide on. She had a TV we might want, a movie collection that didn't make me cringe too much, a book collection that I wasn't even going to try to move myself, and a guitar that made me wonder how well she played. By the time she got home, I had a lot of packing done and had a full truckload moved back home. It's funny how I'd started thinking of it as home the last few weeks with her. For the next few days, that's all we did. In the evening, we'd combed through her apartment for a while, and then we'd settle down. We didn't have sex every night, but we were all over each other whenever we were together. She enjoyed the simple pleasure of curling up naked with me, and I loved nothing more than the feel of her skin, whether we were making love or just spooned together in the dark at the end of the day. It was like heaven to me. Wednesday morning, we boarded a flight to Denver, my first time setting foot in the city in over 3 years. I was nervous, not so much about what waited for us. That would be fine. I was more worried about what feelings I was bringing with me. Lori held my hand and squeezed it tight in support. She knew this was hard for me. We talked to Mike and Mary about our travel plans, and they understood, telling us that we should plan on doing something for Christmas, but we were vague about what so far. When we got off the plane, Hope was waiting for us. Carl was at home and would see us when we got back to the house. I hugged Hope warmly, and she squeezed me back. It's so good to see you up and moving around, she told me. I was limping a little and had my cane in case I needed it, but right now, I was feeling okay, even for having sat in coach for a couple of hours. It's good to be able to hug you, I told her emotionally. All we could really do before was an awkward squeeze. It's so good to see you. We were renting a car for our stay in town, so the 3 of us walked to the rental counter, laden down with luggage for our trip. We'd ended up with a decent-sized SUV, for my comfort getting in and out of it. Yes, we were all aware that I still had issues with small cars. Everyone was polite enough not to say anything, though. My mother was planning a big dinner tomorrow night, but today was just us with Hope and Carl. Hope and my mother talked some, but Bill was never going to get a kind word from them, so they were opting to stay home tomorrow night. Bill and Linda still didn't know I was in town. This was going to be a surprise. We chatted pleasantly with Hope, who warmed right up to Lori on the drive. We really had gotten to the point where we were all ready to put Sabrina to rest. I think telling them that I still wanted them in my life going forward and bringing Lori home to meet them had done a lot to ease their sense of loss. We got back to the house, and they showed me to Sabrina's old room. They'd done it over into a guest room, but there were some faint traces around the room if one knew where to look. The holes she'd poked in the walls with thumbtacks for her posters growing up, a trace of tape residue on the edges of the mirror where she'd put up pictures of her adventures with friends, a hint of pink tinge peeking through the white in places where they'd repainted the walls from the bright color it had been when she'd made this room her own. It would have been easy to be maudlin at a moment like that, but instead, I felt glad to be there with Lori. It was another moment where I felt like she was watching us with approval. We joined Hope and Carl in the den when we dropped off our bags and sat to talk about things in more detail. Carl was struck dumb by Lori's looks, but that was a common reaction to Lori. I still had it myself, so I was hardly about to laugh at his plight. Lori was used the reaction, but Hope was feeling less charitable than I was and asked Carl sweetly if he needed his nitro spray. That got all of us laughing a little, Carl included, as he took it with a good nature. Carl caught me up on what had been going on with work. He sold insurance, and while there was nothing earth-shaking in the industry, There was always some office melodrama that he reported on for Hope's entertainment. Today, we were included in the tales of the latest office romances, and he told the tale with a flair for storytelling. I told him that he ought to think about writing, and he scoffed, telling me that he was only good for entertaining at parties, and only then if there was plenty of drinking. Lori liked them, and they adored her. She could have had a third arm and a club foot, and they would have loved her for the smile she put on my face. But that was a reaction she'd get more and more this week. The four of us went out to dinner, and then to Sabrina's grave afterwards. It was the first time I'd been to this spot since the funeral. We laid flowers on the site, and I said a few words to her in my head before I blew her a kiss and took Lori's hand. We all stood in silence for a few minutes, and then we made our way back to the truck for a drive around town. I showed Lori the intersection where it happened, and we drove past the restaurant I'd worked at and a few other local places in brief before we returned to get settled for the night. We were beat. The early start and the flight and spending the day with Hope and Carl had drained us physically and emotionally. Carl had taken the day off work to spend time with us, but he was going to be working tomorrow, so it would be just the two of us since Hope had taken to volunteering for Mothers Against Drunk Driving after my accident. I got the impression she might have been volunteering before that, but I didn't remember hearing alcohol being brought up as a factor in Sabrina's death, so I left it alone. We turned in early and promised to be back at a reasonable hour the next evening. We had a key to the house while we were here, and Hope had told us not to worry about them. So we all went to bed planning to go our separate ways the next morning. That night, Lori and I just cuddled. Sabrina's parents were in the next room, so it didn't feel particularly sexy for us to have at it. We drifted off to sleep together though, and we were both contented with each other. The next day, we went to visit the MAD offices where Hope volunteered and spoke with a few people about my accident and recovery. Then we went to have lunch at the restaurant I'd worked at, and I introduced her to Tony. He and I caught up about Mike in a few brief words, but mostly, he entertained Lori with stories about me. That explains breakfast, she said knowingly when he told her about the summer I'd worked as a cook. She took in Tony's bewildered face and patted his arm. Pizza whiz in the kitchen, she told him. He makes breakfast every day, and it's perfect every time. I tell you that I taught him everything he knows, Tony said with a smile, but he grew the skills on his own. Started out with asking to cook his own lunch in the kitchen, and we let him try out a few things. We even added a few of his creations to our menu. They chatted like that for a little while, with her raving about things I cooked for her and Tony taking credit for a lot of them. Tony, the only thing you ever invented was that bullshit story. I snorted when he'd just taken credit for another meal that Lori had loved. If I lifted any recipes, they were your mother's, and she'd be very disappointed if she heard you calling them yours. He shrugged sheepishly. Hey, the fried chicken is mine. She never used anything other than flour on her chicken. He left us alone after a few more comments, and we finished our lunch pleasantly. It's nice here, she said, smiling at me. It's almost like the ideal American city. I shrugged. In some ways, I admitted. In some ways, LA is ideal. Yeah? How? She challenged me. Well, it's the American dream, I said. Today, you could be a waiter in a cafe, and tomorrow you could be on TV, rich, famous, and adored by all. There's such a clash of cultures out there that it's the exact melting pot that our forefathers talked about. She shrugged. I suppose, but there's also a lot of fake out there. You can be that waiter and end up on TV, only to find yourself back waiting tables in a year. I nodded. True, but that dream still exists. She shrugged again and went back to being enamored by the sights of Denver. We drove to my parents' place and I parked outside, thinking that the last time I'd been here was 7 years ago when I'd kicked Dad in the balls. I looked at the house and then at Lori and took a deep, calming breath. Don't worry, she said. It won't be that bad. I'm here with you. I nodded. I know, I said, still wrapped in dread. It's just been a long time. We got out and she took my hand, giving it a squeeze as we walked to the front door. I rang the bell rather than walk in. This wasn't my home anymore, and I wasn't comfortable enough to take liberties. Mom came to the door and scolded me. You don't need to ring the bell, she said with a smile on her face. Come in, let me get a look at you. She stepped back and hugged me like I was back from the dead. It's so good to see you up and walking. She took in the cane and looked sympathetic. Is that going to be permanent? I think so, I told her with a shrug. It's better than the alternative. I introduced her and Lori, and she was stunned by Lori's beauty. You're so beautiful, she gushed. I don't know how Petey does it, but he keeps finding more and more beautiful women to share his time with. Lori grinned under the praise. Well, I suppose it's because he doesn't settle, she said. He'd rather be alone than date someone who doesn't make him happy. She nodded, and we started getting to know each other. Dad was still at work and Linda and Bill were invited to dinner, but didn't know we were in town yet. The two of us helped around the kitchen with getting dinner ready, which was my mother's glazed ham. The glaze was a combination of secret ingredients that was known to everyone in the family and half of Mom's close friends. For those of you that are curious, it's a combination of sugar, pineapple juice, and barbecue sauce. It's not a complicated mix. She just likes to think that it's the end of the culinary evolution for the dish. It was good, but part of that was the nostalgia of youth. The three of us spent the rest of the afternoon talking and getting too acquainted while we cooked, and by the time my father was home, Lori and Mom were talking easily. Dad was gruff as usual, but he looked happy to see us. His eyes widened at the sight of Lori, and he shook his head, looking at me. Must be hung like a horse, he muttered to himself as he went to take a shower and change before dinner. We were just about ready to start taking up dinner when the front door opened again. "Ma," Linda's voice called out from the hall. "Who owns the truck parked out front?" Mom went to meet them, leaving Lori and me in the kitchen alone for a few minutes, but we could hear the conversation clearly. "We're having company for dinner," she told them lightly. "Here, let me take the baby. You two take your shoes off and go say hello." I could hear the baby cry for a moment before she quieted again, as she was passed to her grandmother. "Company?" Bill asked, surprised by the news. "Dad didn't mention anything at work today." "I told him not to," she said, and then carried little Petra off to the living room while they came to the kitchen door. The two of us were standing with our backs against the counter, watching them come into the room. Linda caught sight of us first and screamed, "Peter!" before she came across the room to hug me like Mom had, squeezing me tight as Bill crossed the room more slowly, letting her have her greeting first. She eventually leaned back to look at me, but didn't let go. "I can't believe you're here. When did you get here?" "We flew in yesterday," I told her. "We're staying with Hope and Carl." She blinked and realized for the first time that I wasn't alone. She took in Lori, smiling and finally letting me go. "You have got to be Lori," she said, letting me go and hugging her in greeting. "Peter said you were gorgeous. I just thought he was exaggerating because he was in love." "Hi," Lori said sweetly. "You're Linda, right? Pete's told me about you too. I hope he told you a few good things, at least," she said sheepishly. "Don't worry," she said. "He's usually pretty easygoing about a lot of it." While they were talking, Bill came to me and shook my hand. He smiled at me with a touch of concern. The last time we talked, I'd been too weak and injured to attack him, but now I was mostly recovered if I wanted to wreck the kitchen with him. I just took his hand. "Relax," I told him. I meant what I said at the hospital. Some of the tension eased out of him, and he nodded. We gathered up dinner with Linda's help, and we all sat down for a relatively low-stress family dinner. We fielded most of the same questions we got last night, telling about how we'd met and what we had in common. We both liked the same kinds of music, had similar sense of humor, and preferred the same movies. We were extremely compatible overall. "What about the bedroom?" Linda asked leadingly. "I can honestly say that he's the best, most considerate lover I've ever had," Lori said without hesitation. "Really?" Linda asked, sounding a little surprised. That got my attention, and I was starting to dislike how this conversation was turning out. "Absolutely," Lori told her. "The first time he took me to bed, he had me trembling and wide-eyed. I had to stop him because I couldn't take it anymore." "That's interesting," Linda said, clearly still surprised by the testimonial. "We'll have to find some time to get together for girl talk." Lori smiled back. "We're staying until Sunday," she said lightly. "Why don't we go for a spa day on Saturday?" she suggested. "It'll be a good chance for us to chat." "Do you mind?" she asked, turning toward me. "Not at all," I said with a smile. "I can entertain myself for a few hours. Maybe I'll spend the day wandering around to see what's changed since I've been here." She nodded, and they made solid plans for a day together. "Why don't we play a round of golf while they're out?" Bill suggested. "Dad and I go out every Saturday." "Who'd watch Petra?" I asked. "I usually do," Mom answered. "She loves her time with Grandma." I shrugged. "I've never played, but the worst that can happen is that I can't swing properly with my leg messed up." "We'll have to rent you a set of clubs," Dad said. "You're too tall for my old ones now." I nodded. I suppose that made sense. You guys know the game. I'm just along for the ride. We talked for a while longer over dinner and the cleanup, but nothing of substance was really said. We ended up in the living room with Petra settled in my arms for most of the evening. "I can't believe she settled right down for you," Linda said, watching me with her daughter. "She never warms up to strangers." "It hasn't been that long since you introduced her to me," I reminded her. "Besides, kids seem to love me. Petey and Sabrina go nuts when I show up to visit." Lori watched me with the baby and smiled. "Are you sure that's not because you usually have presents for them?" she asked knowingly. "Maybe," I admitted, "but they don't stop being excited after they get their presents." She chuckled to herself. The evening was pleasant overall. Bill did study Lori a bit, but I chalked some of that up to him wanting to know what she saw in me. If only he knew. They had to leave and get the baby to sleep, so we had a little more time with the parents. We talked about life in LA and Lori told them tales about her career as a nurse. I also talked about my time in Texas and my experience with rattlesnakes while on the job. Ever been bitten? Dad asked me curiously. No, I said. Had to shoot a few of them though. A lot of the boys carried pistols to protect themselves and identify the snake if someone was bitten. That makes it easier to treat if doctors know what snake venom you've got running through you. We chatted about subjects like that for a while, and then we decided to call it a night before it was too late. When we got back to Hope and Carl's, they were settled in the den, watching CNN and doing their own hobbies. Hope made beaded jewelry in her spare time and Carl was into knitting, which I found to be hilarious and always had. What's your new project? I asked him as we settled in to talk a bit before bed. I'm making a blanket for you, he said. After seeing your apartment, I decided that you don't have enough homemade stuff to make your apartment feel cozy, so I'm making you something for your bed. Thanks, I said, surprised that he was doing this for me. I don't know what to say. I've never had a hand-knitted blanket before. This is nothing, he scoffed. I can have it done in a few weeks easily. Wait until I have to put together a wedding gift for you. I'll have to get out my crochet hooks for that. No hints though. I'm far less ambitious, Hope told us with a chuckle. I'm making a necklace for Lori. We looked at what she was doing and it was a very good-looking necklace. We sat and watched TV, chatting while we watched them work on gifts for us. I felt like I needed to do something for them, but I wasn't nearly so craft-talented as they were. Then again, I was disabled with a taste of semi-retired. I had time to pick up a craft as a hobby. Finally, they put aside their supplies, and the four of us went to bed at the same time. Lori and I quietly spent time together, being mindful of not disturbing anyone. We were still curled up, relaxing, when Lori started to giggle. I asked what was so funny, and she shushed me. Listen, she whispered. When I did, I could hear faint sounds from Hope and Carl in the other room. It was quiet but unmistakable, and I joined Lori in a soft chuckle, feeling happy that the house was filled with love that night. We drifted off after a while, deeply in love with each other and satisfied that we'd inspired them to renew their love for each other. The next morning, I slipped out of bed early and started coffee brewing for breakfast. I knew where everything in the kitchen was, so I started working on that too while I was at it. Hope joined me a short time later, surprised that I was up and moving. I thought you might want to sleep in a bit today, she said when she entered the kitchen. I'd been thinking the same about you too, I shot back. Busted, she admitted with a rueful shrug of her shoulders, as she took one of the 4 cups I set out and poured herself some coffee. You heard us? We kind of assumed you'd heard us and decided that it sounded like fun, I said lightly. We never did get around to fixing the soundproofing inside the house, she admitted. Sabrina used to know every time we made love when she was growing up. I laughed at that and went back to making breakfast. By the time Carl was at the table, I had eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns ready for him. I'd already served Hope, and when Lori joined us, sleepily, I set a plate in front of her and then got my own breakfast. As soon as I sat down, Hope bounced up and started cleaning up. We didn't really have anything planned for the day, so when Carl went to work, the 3 of us went shopping for the day. It was pleasant to get out and see some of the old haunts that I'd left behind. We shopped craft and hobby stores for things that would be useful to both Hope and Carl in their respective hobbies, and a few other trinkets for the rest of the family. We popped over to get Eva's sweater from the college and things like that. I got some Denver and Colorado-themed presents for Mike and Mary, and then we went to lunch. After lunch, we shopped for groceries for the house to help replace what we'd used up since we arrived. Hope was a little reluctant to accept that, but we insisted. We were a little more vocal in bed on Friday night, and just like before, our lovemaking inspired a similar commitment next door. We delighted in that and hoped that they weren't just being polite for our sake, and that they were all over each other regularly without our help. I was up to fix breakfast again on Saturday morning, and Hope was the first one out of bed. You might want to ease off on the cooking, she told me. On Saturday, Carl sleeps in. He won't want to move before lunch. I nodded and planned for 3 instead. So, are you two always this romantic, or are you just making noise to be polite so we don't feel like we're disturbing you? I asked with a smirk. She blushed. Well, we never really stopped being interested in each other, she said. Having you two around these last few days has gotten us fired up though. I think Carl's developing a crush on Lori, she told me conspirationally. I nodded. Lori has that effect on a lot of people, men and women. She oozes sex appeal. I was a little worried that I was going to have a problem with Bill the other night since he stole my first girlfriend from me. I thought he might have wanted a chance to do it again, since Lori is so gorgeous. He behaved himself, though. She nodded. I know that Sabrina told us. He'd been miserable to you. Nearly getting you killed on the job and what happened with how he met his wife. I nodded. Well, he's grown up a lot over the past 3 years, I admitted. Maybe that night stuck in his head and changed him. Maybe it's because he has a daughter to think about now, but either way, he's less of an a-hole than he used to be. She sat, lost in thought about that for a while and shrugged. I'll never have to deal with him again. He killed my baby and I'll never forgive that, but I understand why you have. I was making pancakes this morning and put a short stack in front of her to start her off. I think you should consider letting it go. I told her gently. Not for him, certainly. For yourself though, and for Sabrina. I know she wouldn't want you to carry that anger with you. Do it for yourself too, because every time you have a negative thought about him, it's a moment that you could have been focused on happiness. She thought about that for a little bit and sighed. How did you get to be so smart? She asked with a little pride in her voice. Smart? I laughed. I'm dumb as a stump. Sabrina led me around by the nose until she could find someone capable of keeping me out of trouble. She joined me in laughing, and the two of us settled down to eat. I was mostly done with mine when Lori arrived, looking radiant. I immediately got up, gave her a kiss, and started making breakfast for her. We were going over to Mom and Dad's and separating from there for the day. I secretly thought I'd have more fun going with them and getting my nails done, but I was committed to walking around a golf course all day with Bill and Dad. My leg was already telling me that this was a bad idea. We embraced the horror though, and I got the rental of a set of clubs and shoes. We had a friend of Bill's join us for a fourth, and the three of them talked about local issues. I was mostly left to concentrate on the game and occasionally brought into the conversation when something less personal was the topic. It was the 6th hole where I started getting questions about my cane. So what happened? Jason asked. He was nursing a beer out of the cooler that had taken up residence in the cart we were using. Car accident. I told him SUV T-boned me. Thankfully, I wasn't driving a small car, or they'd still be sponging me out of the cracks in the building. Hell, he said wisely. That must have sucked. You go after the other driver? I shrugged. It gets better all the time, I said dismissively. Everything's settled, but I can't go into details. He nodded and the topic moved on to something else. I was just as happy. By the end of the round, it was lunchtime. My leg was screaming, so the 4 of us went up to the clubhouse for something to eat while they talked about their game. I turned in my clubs and my shoes after lunch and told them that I couldn't handle another round, which was their plan for the afternoon. Hell, I shouldn't have done the full 18. So I hung out in the clubhouse, nursing soda while they took their threesome out for the afternoon. I could have gone out with them on the course, I supposed, but I was pretty miserable and I wanted a little alone time. The highlight of my day was when we got back to the house and saw the results of Lori's day at the spa. She always looked fantastic, but my eyes nearly came out of my head at the sight of her after a day of relaxing and pampering. Wow, I said. You look amazing. I don't even know what to say. You always look like a supermodel, but right now? That word doesn't do you justice. She giggled cutely and came to kiss me. You're sweet. Biased, but sweet. Bill tried to give Linda some of the same praise, but it sounded a little contrived after my outburst. Dad had planned a barbecue tonight and went out to start the grill. Years ago, he'd built a permanent barbecue out of the back of a popular mechanics magazine. It was huge, with 8 burners, surrounded with brick and housed 2 propane tanks underneath. I don't know why he wanted that much space. We hardly ever had that many people to the house, but tonight, with 6 of us, it got a bit more of a workout. We all adjourned to the back patio where we talked and Dad ran the grill. I was asked about golfing and admitted that it wasn't a bad game, but I thought it was too hard on my leg. Lori gave me a searching look and I shrugged. I didn't play the second round, I told her. I just relaxed at the clubhouse while they finished their day. You should have called it a day before it got that bad. She scolded me gently. Next time, I will, I promised. She stayed close to me though and massaged my leg a little, knowing that she'd have to do a more thorough job tonight if I was going to be able to move tomorrow. Surprisingly, that didn't bring a round of jokes at my expense. As a matter of fact, Bill was watching her hands longingly, and even Dad occasionally glanced at what she was doing. Unfortunately for them, they hadn't escaped the notice of their wives, and I could tell that it was likely not going to be massage night for either of them. I relaxed while food cooked and I found myself smiling at my sexy other half. She smiled right back and helped work the knots out of my thigh as much as she could right here. The food turned out to be everything I remembered from our barbecues growing up. There were steaks, chicken, ribs, and sausages all done to perfection. There were also skewers of vegetables, baked potatoes, and ears of corn. By the time we were done, we were all stuffed and there was still a pile of food left. That got split into 3 piles. One went in the fridge, one went with Bill and Linda, and Mom asked me to bring the third back to Carl and Hope. We spent the rest of the evening enjoying our time together, and there was some mention of doing something for Christmas. I told them that I needed to make time for Mike and for Rosa to meet Lori, but we'd see what we could arrange. We have 2 spare rooms here, Mom said. I'll talk to your brother about bringing the kids here instead of you going down there. Rosa can stay with us, Linda volunteered. We have plenty of room. I guess if Hope and Carl are interested in company, then we can make that work, I said, thinking that it might be the closest we could come to having everyone for the holiday. That assumes that Lori's parents aren't insistent on us coming to see them for Christmas, I pointed out quickly. We begged off relatively early since we had to pack for our flight tomorrow, but promised we'd be in touch about Christmas. By the time we got back to Carl and Hope's, my leg was still feeling stiff, but better than it had been. They were delighted by the leftovers and the tentative plans for Christmas. They also remarked about how stunning Lori looked after her day with Linda. That night, we weren't particularly careful about how much noise we made, and Hope and Carl reciprocated. Their cries started our cries again, and I started to think that if we didn't get out of here soon, the 4 of us would dispense with the bedrooms and just crowd the living room since we were practically in the same room as it was. That next morning, Hope was walking a little gingerly, and we were all smiles. "We're gonna miss you kids," she told us as we sat for breakfast. She took one of our hands in each of hers. I haven't felt so young since Sabrina started going to sleepovers. We chuckled about that. "Does that mean we're welcome to come back and make noise in the middle of the night?" "You better," she said, and then lowered her voice. "I think seeing your pretty face has inspired him to be more passionate," she told Lori with an amused chuckle. Yesterday morning, I caught him critiquing himself in the mirror, sucking in his stomach, puffing out his chest, that sort of thing. "I'm sure if you come back for Christmas, we can get him into a gym. I've been after him to do that for a few years now." Lori giggled, blushing at the thought of Carl developing a crush on her. "That's too adorable," she said when she could talk again. We finished our last-minute packing after breakfast, and then we were off to the airport with hugs and kisses from Hope and Carl, who'd just gotten up to see us off. I felt a little conflicted about Denver now. It had brought me nothing but tragedy, but it was still home to me on some level. It resonated with me. I guess that would be the best way to put it. Sometimes that resonance hurt. Sometimes it was comforting. The last few days had been comforting. I thought that the pain was mostly behind me, so long as nothing opened those old wounds. Lori and I were disgustingly affectionate as we waited for boarding, and then again once we were settled in our seats for the flight. "Nervous?" I asked. "A little," she admitted. "I really want my parents to love you." I squeezed her hand, and we settled in for takeoff. "I'm sure it'll be fine," I told her soothingly, but I was worried too, and I knew it showed. "Even if they don't love me, they'll eventually come to accept me." "You really think?" she asked hopefully. "Sure. Linda's parents always liked me, so when she ended up with Bill, they despised him. That only got worse as he kept doing bad things to me. Eventually, though, they got to the point where they accept him. They might not like him, but they accept him." She nodded. "I don't want them to accept you, though," she frowned. "I want them to welcome you. Like a son?" I finished the thought knowingly. My face might pave the way for that a little. The beret might get us some mileage, too. She nodded. "I want to talk to them as soon as we get there and explain that. They have to know before we even go upstairs." I agreed, and we decided on the flight that she'd do most of the talking initially. They were her parents, after all. She knew how to talk to them better than I would. We landed and got our bags, rented a car for our time there, and then headed south toward New Prague where her parents' farm was. She pointed out a lot of local sights as we traveled, and generally kept up an excited chatter. This was where she'd grown up, and she didn't get back here often. I got the sense that she'd stayed away from the place after Jeff died. I could understand that. I'd done the same thing after Sabrina had died, only just now crossing that line. I was seated in the passenger seat this time as she drove, which only made sense since I had no idea where we were going and she did. The city had quickly faded out to smaller settlements and farm fields as they headed south, and all too quickly, Lori turned the car into a long drive, leading up to a largish house. It was flanked by a pair of large barns and several other outbuildings. I took in the look of the place and felt a sense of rightness about the place. I couldn't put a finger on it, but it felt very much like my mental impression of what the place would be like. It wasn't a perfect match. The lane had been paved and the barns were painted white or were covered in metal sheeting for siding. I'd imagined them being red for some reason, with dirt lane and a rustic porch on the house, but none of that was true. The feel of the yard matched the impression, though. It was the details I'd gotten wrong. We'd just come to a stop when her mother came to the door to greet us. I could see where Lori got her looks. Gwendolyn Johnson looked like she was in her mid-30s, not her late 40s. She had a lusher figure than Lori, but I could see the same sparkle in her eyes even from this distance, and she had the same dazzling smile as she came down the steps. Lori was already out of the car, squealing with delight at seeing her mother. I got out of the car quietly while they hugged. I got my cane under me and waited with a smile on my face while they held on to each other, swaying back and forth. "You must be." She trailed off as she caught sight of my face, all the color leaving hers. "Jeff?" she gasped, one hand going to cover her mouth as she stared into the face of a ghost. I smiled at her sadly and wished I could tell her that I was him. "No, ma'am," I said gently. "I'm Peter." I came forward and was about to offer her my hand when she reacted. She reached up to touch my face with both hands, her fingers trembling as tears formed in her eyes. "You look so much like him," she whispered, touching me tentatively as if worried that I wasn't real and I'd fade away if pressed too hard. I smiled and took a chance, giving her a very gentle hug. She wrapped her arms around me and took a moment to regain her composure. "I know," I whispered in her ear. "I wish I could have gotten to know him." She gave me another squeeze and then sniffed, getting hold of herself and leading us inside. We took our luggage out of the car and she called her husband on his cell phone to let him know that we'd arrived. We were waiting for her father to arrive before we told them the story of how I'd met Jeff. About 20 minutes later, we heard the sound of an ATV rumbling into the yard and shutting off. We were settled at the kitchen table with cups of coffee with her mother staring at me in wonder that I looked so much like Jeff. Lori went to meet him and wrapped her arms around him. "Daddy," she yipped happily at the reunion. "Try not to be too shocked when you see Pete, Dad." Mom nearly peed her pants. "You're not too old to go over my knee, young lady." Her mother barked sharply at that. Gordon Johnson looked me over as he stood in the doorway, Lori hanging from his neck and looking like a tornado couldn't uproot him. He seemed more solid than a century-old oak, but the sight of me made him back up a step. I stood and came to offer him my hand. "Hello, sir," I said. "I'm Peter Hamilton." He blinked again and took my hand absently. "Hello, Peter," he said faintly. He stared at me for a long moment and then shook himself. "Forgive my manners. You just look a great deal like our son." I nodded. "I know. He and I met once. It was like looking in a mirror." "You knew Jeff?" he asked, surprised. "How did you meet?" "Let's sit down, Daddy. That's a rather large story." The four of us sat down and she told the story about how we'd met and become closer. She talked about my connection to Sabrina and how she'd helped guide me in dreams after her death. Then she told them about the last time I dreamed of her and saw Jeff with her. "Well, that's just a dream," her father scoffed. "It's certainly a very romantic story, but things like that don't happen." Lori smiled and pulled out the beret, placing it on the table. "That was on the kitchen table waiting for us the next morning," she said. He reached for it, but his wife was quicker, snatching it up. "I tucked that into a garment bag with his dress uniform about a month ago," she said. "How did you get it?" "Mom, neither of us has been upstairs since we got here, and you remember seeing it since I last came to visit." Jeff spoke to Peter, and then left this so we'd know he was really there. Gwen put the hat down and left the room, climbing the stairs to check where she knew she'd put it. While she was gone, I told Gordon about the bottle of tequila that Sabrina had taken and returned. As far as I can tell, they left together and happy to explore whatever comes after this life. When she returned, she looked slightly ashen. "It's gone," she said, sitting down and picking up the hat. She touched the stenciled name inside the hat and looked at us both. "How?" she asked. Lori took her hand. "Just like we told you," she said. "He left it for us to let us know we belong to each other now. I don't need a guardian angel anymore. Neither does Peter." That made her parents lapse into a contemplative silence while they considered the idea of life after death for a long moment. We just waited them out and they finally came around. "You both must be hungry," Gwen declared, sniffing and drying her eyes. "I think it's too early for dinner, but I can make you a quick snack to tide you over." The flight had landed after lunchtime, and we admitted we'd had an early start. So in short order, there was a bowl of stew in front of each of us and a basket of rolls that smelled and tasted fresh. I complimented her on the stew and the rolls, and she smiled. "That's sweet of you to say, but the stew is just leftovers from last night, and the rolls are easy to make." Still, it was hot, delicious, and filling. I was gonna gain 10 pounds eating at her table if I wasn't careful. As soon as we were done, she shooed everyone out of the kitchen and started working on dinner. She wanted no help and no interference. Gordon took me out around the barns on a brief tour. I'd never seen farm animals up close, so it was an interesting experience. I almost felt guilty about loving steak when I saw how docile and trusting the cows were. I managed to pat a few of them and some of the sheep, but he kept me well away from his goats. They can be aggressive, he told me. Don't mean nothing. It's just how they are. He was warming up to me as I took more and more interest in what he was doing here. He had a milk herd and a beef herd of cows, sheep for mutton and wool, goats for milk. Hipsters love the shit, he told me. I get nearly double for goat's milk as I do for the cow's milk. They turn it into soap and use it in beauty crap. There's a lady that buys as much as I can sell to her, and I have a couple of others that prefer it to cow's milk, so they buy from me. I nodded and thought it sounded like a fantastic moneymaker. Have you thought about partnering with her instead of just selling to her? I asked. Nah, he scoffed. I wouldn't know how to sell fancy crap. Maybe not, but you know someone who's a computer expert that can take the business from local markets to international overnight, I pointed out. She probably already dabbles in eBay sales. A good website and a few contacts and it might be worth it. The other side of the coin is that I'd have to have a bigger herd and cows are easier to deal with, he told me before we moved on. He had pigs that he kept for his own table, chickens for eggs and meat, and a couple of working dogs that helped with herding the animals. It was a totally new experience for me, and I thought the whole farm was fascinating. I'd been a city kid and had never been out on a farm. We'd gone camping a few times when I was young, but not since Mike had turned 16 and gotten his license. That was the extent of my outdoor adventure. Today, I was surrounded by animals. The dogs were curious, barn cats curled around my ankles, the sheep and cows were eager for attention, and even the goats watched me as we passed. It was like having my own personal petting zoo for the day. He was pointing out the fields he had sectioned off and told me what he was growing in each when he stopped inside. Peter, I'm not sure I approve of you and Lorraine seeing each other, he said. You know how much like Jeff you look. I nodded, figuring that he was about to brush off her attraction as hero worship. Well, they used to be very close. She didn't really get over his death. It would be easy for her to fall for someone that looked like him. We were leaning against a pin, watching the sheep graze while we talked, and I mulled over my response. She told me that I look a lot like him when we first met, but she said that wouldn't have been enough for her to go out with me. She takes a lot of care to point out what's different between us as much as what's the same. He sighed again, finding this whole talk difficult. Lori and Jeff, they were closer than was proper. You know, we raised Jeff after his mom and dad died in a car crash, he said carefully. We never went after them about it, but I talked to Jeff and Gwen. She talked to Lori about birth control and disease and preventing pregnancy. We made sure they were both protected and didn't let on that we knew, but once in a while, she'd sneak into his room and, well, you get the picture. She was always back in her own room in the morning, and there was never a need for a trip to the doctor, but he was more than a brother to her. That's a powerful ghost to live up to. I nodded, stunned that he'd known, but at the same time, he was her father. If anyone was going to sniff out who was messing with his daughter, it was him. I know, I said quietly. She told me about her relationship with him. That surprised him, and he looked at me in shock. That's probably why she takes care to tell me when she notices something different from the way he was. Is he going to come up in our relationship from time to time? He has to. He was her first and her cousin brother and her hero. I can't live up to all that. At the same time, she can't live up to the ghosts of my past. I don't want her to. I just want her to be her. Our ghosts can't make us happy anymore. They can only hurt us. Does she see a little of Jeff in me? I hope so. He served his country and was her lover and her hero. If she sees a little of him in me, I take that as the highest compliment. It doesn't bother you that she might compare you to him? He asked, surprised. Not really, I said. I sometimes compare her to Sabrina in my head, but it's never with disappointment. I compare how they do things where they're similar and where they're different. It's not a competition. Lori's already won. It doesn't bother you that she slept with her own cousin brother? He asked, skeptically. I shrugged. It's really not that uncommon, I don't think, I told him. In my case, I only had brothers, so there was nothing like that, but my first girlfriend cheated on me with my younger brother for a year before they told me. They're married now and have a kid. Lori's time with Jeff ended before she knew I existed. He's a boyfriend that can never come back to try and steal her away from me, just like Sabrina's someone that she never has to worry about staking her claim on me. When she told me about her and Jeff, she said they'd been screwing like goats, and the part that threw me was that I thought the phrase was screwing like bunnies. He chuckled at that and shook his head. Rabbits ain't got a thing on goats. There's a reason they say Randy is a goat. He ran a hand through his hair and shrugged. Okay, so Jeff doesn't bother you. What if she decides in 6 months or a year that you're not the man she thought you were and leaves you? Then I'll be devastated. I'll fight to win her back, but ultimately, if she's lost to me, she's lost to me. I've never been the kind of guy to hit a woman, and I don't intend to start if she gives me bad news, I told him realistically. I don't think either of us will be looking to back out though. You're pretty stuck on her, then? Like glue, I agreed. She's gotten under my skin in a short period of time. That hasn't happened in a long time and never like this. It's not her looks either. Well, not just her looks. That made him laugh a little. Her mother was the prettiest girl I'd ever met. She held that title until I held my little girl for the first time. She was okay losing her crown that way though. I nodded. She's still an unbelievably beautiful woman. I can see where Lori gets her looks. You've got to be the envy of every man that knows you. All except you, I think, he chuckled. I'm glad she told you about Jeff. I couldn't have let it go if she hadn't. You should probably talk to her about it anyway, I suggested. It's in the past, but it's a happy memory that she doesn't think she can share. He mulled that over, and we continued with our walk. I found the farm peaceful. It wasn't exactly quiet. Animals make noise, after all. The sounds were different though, and that made it seem more quiet. When we got back to the house, Lori and her mother were talking at the kitchen table, and the house was filled with the delicious smells of a roast beef. We both went to wash up after being out with the animals and joined them in the kitchen. Lori, her father started as he sat down. I had a long talk with Peter while we were out walking. I kind of figured that, Dad, she said with a hint of amusement. Were you trying to scare him off? Not precisely, but a father has concerns, especially when he finds out that his daughter has been getting very close to someone before she introduces him to her parents, he responded. I'm worried, and I'm sure your mother is too, about how much like Jeff he looks and what role that plays in the attraction. She shrugged. Admittedly, that's what grabbed my attention. Can you blame me? If you put Jeff's uniform on him, you'd have thought he was a ghost. That's not enough to make me stick around though, and certainly not enough to bring him home to you. Peter's sweet. He's thoughtful and kind and pushes himself even when no one expects it of him. Like I said, he was nice to the girl that hit him. He could have ignored her or said something mean to her, but he treated her like an old friend. He even forgave his brother after stealing one girlfriend and killing another. Yeah, but if he even looks at you funny, I'll feed him to your dad's pigs, I said dryly. Not my pigs, he protested. I'm careful about what I feed them. Fair enough. We'll find some pigs that we can feed him to. Or I could just tell him I'm not interested in whatever he has to offer, she suggested. I suppose that could work, I said with some disappointment in my voice. We're getting distracted, her father said, watching the two of us spitball about dealing with Bill. As I was saying, I tried to. Hell. I'm no good with words. Your mother and I have known you, and your cousin Jeff were sleeping together for years. Lori froze, her eyes going wide and her face turning red. You two weren't as quiet as you'd hoped, and we knew Jeff wasn't taking you hiking because you fit in with his friends. Every so often, I'd go downstairs to get a drink and find your bed empty and his double booked. Lori's mouth was moving as she tried to say something, but this was a revelation she hadn't anticipated and she wasn't recovering. So I talked to Peter, worried that you were chasing Jeff's ghost, but he already knew about your love affair with your cousin brother. That told me you were serious about him. He suggested that I tell you that we've known all these years about you and Jeff. I nodded. I didn't think it would be a big deal. It was years ago, and it's the one thing that you haven't been able to talk to them about, and it's the one side of him that you weren't able to mourn even with them when he passed away. She smiled at me, her eyes watery as she nodded. You were the first person I ever told, she said to me, her voice thick with emotion. I wish I'd said something before. Then her mother was standing by her chair, hugging her and her father, and I came around to offer our own support as she wept for this one last part of her childhood that she'd never been able to let go of before. So that was what broke the ice between me and her parents. We shared the big family secret and came to understand each other. We stayed 5 days with her parents and let them get to know me and let me get to know Minnesota. I was introduced to people Lori had grown up with, and we came to enjoy the looks of shock we'd get as we walked around town. And yes, she did sneak into Jeff's room to be with me at night. Her parents knew. She wasn't trying to put one past them, but that was how she was used to acting under their roof. That Christmas, we had a large gathering in Denver. Rosa stayed with Linda and Bill, Mike, Mary, and the kids stayed with Mom and Dad. We stayed with Hope and Carl and Gwen, and Gordon even managed to fly in for a few days. They stayed with Linda and Bill too, since they had the second guest room. It wasn't very often that we all got together like that. Even Linda's parents and Carl and Hope joined us for Christmas dinner, calling a truce to their discomfort with Bill. It was a tremendously successful celebration, though I'd been nervous that tensions would flare up between Bill and Carl. I was pleasantly surprised though, and the day went off without a hitch. It was good to see the Coopers again, and they treated me like a long-lost son, fawning over Lori and I a little more than they did over Bill and Linda, but that's just as possibly because it had been so long since they'd seen me. In fact, The only tense moment had been when I took Lori's hand and got down on one knee, ring in hand, to ask her to be mine, now and always. She shrieked and said yes, right away, but it was still harrowing for me to hang on the moment waiting for her to react. We got married in May of the following year in New Prague. Lori's maid of honor was her best friend from high school. Mike was my best man. I invited Chloe Sinclair to be there, and she actually showed up. She was grateful for the gesture of forgiveness and felt relieved at knowing that some good came from the accident, knowing that Lori was a nurse. We laughed at the number of people at the reception that were fans of her show, and she was as much the center of attention as we were. The first dances were a fiasco, owing to the fact that we now had 4 sets of parents. Rosa had brought her new boyfriend, Raymond, to the wedding, and she confessed to me that it looked like she was going to the altar herself. Rosa Beatrice Hamilton was born the following summer and became Daddy's little princess from the moment I held her. Hope Teresa Hamilton was born a year later, and Jeffrey Roger Hamilton came a year after that. We'd stayed in LA, though we traveled regularly to see family. We finally decided that we needed a house, and that we needed one big enough to host gatherings. We found a real estate agent named Cecilia, who was a godsend. She found us a large house in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification. It was a 5-bedroom house that needed just about everything done to it, but the price and renovations were in our budget. When the family found out, they descended on us. Mike and Mary booked their vacation to come out and help. Dad and Bill drove down from Denver for theirs, and between the 4 of us, we had the house whipped into shape in no time. Lori was still working full-time, and I was consulting part-time as I could, being a stay-at-home dad. We moved in, and as soon as we were settled, I started work on a detached garage with an apartment above it, just like at Rose's. Picking away at it myself, it was nearly a year before I could declare it complete and start working on the yard. It seemed like there was always some project on the go, from a pool for the kids and the privacy fence to go with it, to the hot tub and barbecue, to an orange tree so the kids could pick their own oranges in the summer. I was 35 before it was perfect, and we were just about to send Jeff to school for the first time. Lori's schedule sometimes gave her weekdays off, and with the kids at school, we were able to do all the things we'd done when we were younger. My wife had the most beautiful golden tan with no hint of tan lines, and every part of the house and yard had been christened by us, thanks to our privacy fence. We were lounging in the hammock I had strung up between our orange tree and the lime tree I'd put in a few years after the orange tree when Lori started tracing the scar on my bare hip. She generally did that when she wanted something, so I looked at her questioningly. "I'm just about due to get my birth control implant replaced," she reminded me softly before she giggled. "Unless someone wants to have one more baby before we stop?" I could never say no to that woman. Life goes on. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.